So there we go. We're now recording. So thank you very much to everyone for attending to today's workshop. It's gonna be very casual kind of like engagement and discussions with some of the impressive submissions to today's workshop. But more particularly, just really thinking about how do we do research, in a time of a pandemic and beyond the pandemic, in the context of digital media and migration. So before we start today's workshop, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we work and live, the people of the Kula Nation, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and future. So some housekeeping for today's workshop. Each keynote speaker would be given 20 minutes to present their work, and also followed by a 10-minute Q&A. Then for our presenters, we have 12 minutes for each presentation. And then we have a Q&A at the end of all presentations in each panel. So that would be 17 to 19 minutes of Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can type those questions in the chat box, and How and I will be monitoring the questions, and later we'll be asking them to our keynote speakers and the presenters. So for the speakers, keynote speakers will give you a 5-minute kind of like warning to kind of like wrap up your presentation, and for our presenters, a 3-minute reminder to wrap up the presentation. If you want to engage with today's workshop and you're active on Twitter, you can use our hashtag, which is hashtag immobile entanglements. So I'll be tweeting as well about the presentations. And lastly, kindly mute your microphone so the speakers won't be distracted in giving the presentations. And we're very fortunate because today we have at least 80 people who registered for this event apart from the members of MDM. So congratulations everyone, and thank you for participating in today's exciting workshop. So now I'll introduce our first keynote speaker, and we're very delighted to have him, contacting him on email and giving us yes, I can do this, and I'm very happy for that. And Koy and I were kind of just discussing. We're very fortunate to have him. So our first keynote speaker is Wee Kim Wee, Professor of Communication Studies from Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He's widely published on mobile media and communication, with his most recent books being App, From Mobile Phones to Digital Lives, coming out this year through Polity, and the co-edited volumes Oxford Handbook of Mobile Communication and Society in 2020, and Location Technologies in International Context in 2019. He is a long-standing research interests and collaborations in disability, digital technology, and social justice, with books including the co-edited Routledge Companion to Disability in Media, Disability and the Media with Katie Ellis, and Digital Disability with Christopher Newell. So he is also a founding co-editor of the journal Internet Histories, with Mark McClellan edited the 2017 volume Routledge Companion to Global Internet Histories. So we're very fortunate to have today's keynote speaker, one of the keynote speakers, to present a paper on apps, mobilities, and migration in the COVID-19 pandemic. Please welcome Professor Gerard Gugin. Go, Gerard.
Thank you so much, Irvin and Kern. Also, I'm just thrilled to be able to join. I feel very fortunate, and so thank you so much. I'm based in Singapore, in Southeast Asia for the last couple of years. I can see some people are here and people are from around the world, which is fantastic. But today I'm actually in Wiradjuri country, in country New South Wales. So I just wanted to pay my respects to elders here, past and present, and to any Indigenous people at the workshop today. So let me just share my sort of simple PowerPoint. Can everyone see that okay? Yep, okay. So, so today I want to talk particularly about apps and mobilities and migration in the COVID pandemic. I mean, I think it's such a timely workshop for all sorts of reasons. So, and I'm not, primarily, of course, a migration scholar. I more come from mobile communication research, and I'm very involved. Actually, we're on the last day of the IAMCR conference that people may be going to, the International Association of Media Communications Research. So I'm involved with and very engaged around the group there on global media policy as well as communication policy and technology. So I suppose my starting point is this sense, right, the gambit of the workshop, that digital media has been highly visible in the COVID pandemic in a wide variety of ways. So I'm going to talk about apps. And apps, you know, much to my perhaps pleasure and sometimes horror, as I was writing a book on apps, which was way over deadline. But the lockdown in Singapore about a year or so ago was an excellent time to just get on with it. And I think that's the apps have played out in all sorts of ways, right? I mean, they've played out as media and information technologies. And you think of the different ways in which people have used a whole range of different platforms to circulate media communications. There's a phenomenon of TikTok around different migrant groups around the world, but particularly around Southeast Asia, I think is really interesting, and some great research going on that's been highlighted in the workshops that Crystal Abadan and colleagues have been doing around TikTok, for instance. But I think also, and perhaps more my focus is an interest has been the kind of deployment of apps around particular pandemic regulatory, public health surveillance and other technologies, and some of the ways in which they are impacted and woven into mobilities and then to issues of migration. We think about, you know, the contact tracing apps, QR codes, we're all using Bluetooth and other technologies. So I think it's mobile apps are kind of, I think, really interesting in the way they're associated with mobilities, and are particularly important in a range of whole other ways for migrants and migration, and then also for immobilities. So I just wanted to briefly pick up this thread. I mean, it seems to me I could be completely wrong about this. I'm sure you know a lot more about it, but you know, I think there has been a long-standing body of work about immobilities, but I think it's kind of been in the shadows a bit. I mean, I think it is there around, say, the mobilities research. And I think in the mobiles and digital media research literatures, I mean, one of the first people to put it on my radar a decade or so ago was Lucy Hjorth, and her work around immobilities, I think really early on around mobile communication. Then should set just a shout out to Irvin's forthcoming book. You know, these things take a little while on immobile homes in our Oxford, the swan song actually book of our mobile series in studies in mobile communication, which is just moving to Routledge. So I think with the kind of immobilities that people have experienced internationally and sought to make some sense of in COVID times, I think actually it's been the opportunity and the imperative to pay more attention to this side of mobilities, and you know, particularly around your movement of people, right? Movement of people, communicative mobilities, information mobilities. And the social dynamics and political dynamics around this and the role of digital media play, for me, has been writ large in kind of apps. Okay, and in what am I kind of going to talk about? I wrote a piece that came out about a year ago about COVID-19 tracing apps in Singapore and Australia, as well as my mobiles book. And I'm going to talk a bit later on around disability, which I did at the ANZCA conference, and pick up some really speculative thoughts about that. But some of those ideas come from a series of papers I've written with Katie Ellis around COVID-19 and disability. Okay, but I suppose to just think the scene, I just was sort of thinking and recalling and stand massively to be corrected by others around this, the evolution of digital media in migrant experience and research in recent years, you know, perhaps the last kind of decade or two. And I was kind of reminded of the early work on mobile phones and migrants, and particularly struck by the work on the Philippines diaspora, and a shout out here to our Filipino colleagues like Raul Pertiera and others, many who've paved the foundations for mobile communication studies. And then I think I was struck by work on a number of scholars in China, in Hong Kong, elsewhere, on Chinese rural workers and their use of mobile devices. I picked up a little bit in the book I wrote, Cell Phone Culture 2006. There's some mentions in there. Then I think another, I suppose, maybe important sort of phase and moment for this, for me at least, was I think with the rise of the smartphone, the researchers really turn attention to understanding the new cultures of sort of mobile, social media communication in migrant communities and transnational families. So I'm thinking here, for instance, of Mirka Madanal and Danny Miller's work on the concept of polymedia. Interesting, kind of not controversial, but, you know, a very interesting sort of piece of work that I think tried to really advance theorizing around this as well as study. Then I think, you know, more recently, I think there's been this convergence of disciplines. you know, Kern and others and Irvin and others, you'll be much better placed to talk about this. But it seems to me this is, you know, bringing things together around, and I'm just referencing your work, Kern, on the, you know, the youth, diaspora, gender. And I think then your kind of research, I think, starts to around digital media and migrants, starts to go across a whole range of other areas. And just one book, Catherine Gomes's book on transient media, media and migration in Australia and Singapore. And I think there's been this thread of work, important work on refugees, specific kind of group of migrants in particular circumstances. And around the mediations of this. And I was intrigued to see Sarah Marino's recent book, the Mediating the Refugee Crisis. So I was kind of interested, I suppose, to just try and think about and understand this. And I suppose to just say something briefly about digital migration studies, this seems to me, you know, quite kind of important, and I need to know more about this and engage more around it. But I think this is what I kind of like about the body of work that's coming together, is this, you know, exploring the many facets of migration and refugees and some of the role and quality of digital in connection, in care, in encounter and difference and health. And so I think Kern's work, I was just looking at a range of different papers. I know Irvin has got a bunch of work as well. And I think this is just super interesting. And I mean, there's been on, say, areas like care, for instance, there's been a real upsurgence of work on care and digital media in the last couple of years also, right? It was a theme at the International Communication Association this year. And the work I've done over many years in disability studies has a particular kind of facet of work on this. So it's an interesting bunch of stuff here. And I think one of the things I was picking up was this mobile media remain central. So I like this chapter you did, Cohen, in this, the smartphones, digital infrastructures of the displaced, which I think was really cool, saying addressing smartphones as a component of a wider migration infrastructure. And I think that has been something people have been really interested in, right? Actually, from a different perspective, maybe from logistical media studies, the work of you know, Brett Nielsen and others have looked at that, right? To say, in some ways, I think they were starting from more look at what's the ICT's infrastructure around the politics of migration, right, on a large scale across different countries and continents. But I think the smartphone is really interesting here. And I like this idea about, you know, the need to move beyond fetishizing the device and to charting the scholarship across, you know, so not, you know, I suppose continuing to contest the non-media centric that a bunch of people, whether it's Nick Coldry or others, have been doing for a while. And then also the migrant centric and non-migrant centric. I thought this was kind of nice. Okay, so what about apps and migration? So I think apps are really enabling technology of migrants being displaced and finding and shaping new places, you know, the kind of emplacement and replacing the shaping of place that I was lucky to kind of work with Rowan Wilkin and more recently Heather Horst in a collection on location technologies in international contexts. So sort of done 3 collections on location technology and mobile phones and mobile media. And so I think apps play into this as well, right? And I picked up this kind of phrase from that chapter, Cohen, about the multiple modalities of many social media apps, you know, this sense in which they can increase feelings of well-being and emotional belonging and emotional well-being. I think that's really interesting. But I think apps also underscore maybe this kind of dark side, right? Although maybe public health surveillance is not dark side, although it's very contested, right? But the surveillance that's going on in pandemic time around apps. So I was just interested to think here, and maybe also methodologically, thinking around app studies, which is a kind of a bit of a fledgling kind of area. You think, okay, what's the difference between smartphones and apps, right? What are these kind of 2 different things? In some ways, they're very connected, and I think they have been in this conjuncture. So I've got this image here. Actually, it's about smartphones from the introduction to our Oxford companion on mobile communications with Rich Ling and Leopoldina Fortunati and Sun Sen Ling and Yu Ling. And this across the top, it's from Changi Airport. The use of electronic devices is encouraged at all times, and Changi Airport's not been getting too much kind of use probably in recent moments. But the point of this is to say, you know, the growth of the smartphone has just been, you know, kind of continuing, I suppose, and across majority world context, right? The whole international scene that we're trying to put together, and to try and perhaps shift some of the dominant imaginaries, technological imaginaries of communication and mobilities. And this scholarship, I think that we're going to hear through the workshop, is really crucial for this, right? This cutting edge work across different locations from different kind of theoretical specificities is really cool and interesting. So in thinking about apps as media, in the book that's just come out that I've done with Polity, I'm thinking about this thing, well, apps, they're kind of a species of software. So they're designed for and work with hardware in a way that kind of curates and amplifies their affordances. But they're kind of fabric as well, because they're weaving together users, bodies, motion sensors and contexts and environments into these layered digital infrastructures that societies rely upon. And I was thinking, for instance, early scholarship on apps, there was a great, I think, conference that found its way into a special issue of Fiber Culture Journal on apps and affect, right? So it's a really interesting sense in which apps are engaged in something else, right? And I think if we think about apps as media, there's a wide range of ways in which apps extend media and offer a zone of innovation. I'm thinking here of, say, notification and alerts. The great work of Christian Lecoq, on the French mobile scholar, on notification culture is really cool here. Or new kinds of voice media, this sort of protean aspect of apps as media with digital voice assistants that many of us rely upon too. Now, in another sense, I think I've been interested to think about apps as a social laboratory. And part of what I was interested in my book is to look at them via a history of their emergence, for really seeing that, apps have become this way of, for users and practitioners, policymakers, to tackle social and cultural health, relationship and other problems across many domains. I mean, this was picked up, at least 10 years ago with the sort of, there's an app for that, or, there's a kind of app for everything. But I think still there is this real sense in which, we see apps as a kind of social laboratory. And I think two more things that strike me about apps, that apps play a really important, role in how we imagine and frame and design and negotiate emerging and future technologies. So I think this is the post-mobile society that our Japanese colleagues did a collection on, with typical kind of pioneering kind of panache about 4 or 5 years ago. But thinking apps is often not just mobile phones, but apps across all different settings, including cars or smart homes, but also apps as a way to kind of negotiate and frame emerging technologies. And then I think apps are also, you might call it perhaps gnostically, an index of altered social relations. Okay, so far what I've just tried to do is to just kind of think about, where social media, digital media research come from in relation to thinking about migration and mobilities. I've probably said less about mobilities. There's probably more about that. And I think there was a collection of the journal Mobilities a few years ago that took this up. And there's also a companion to Mobilities that does this a lot. But I think, and then to just think about apps. So I think going then forward to think about the kind of app pandemic, I think this has been really quite something I was saying at the outset, that mobile phones have really been a leading feature, mobile phones and apps particularly in relation to the pandemic. But also that one of the intriguing things is at a governmental level or health authorities level, you've had these contact tracing apps being designed for population-wise use, but they really vary in terms of their design, the implementation, the governance and context of use. And actually one of the interesting things, of course, in the pandemic relates to the sort of uptick in scholarly communication, right? And rapid response research, as well as changing the modes of our research where different kinds of perhaps ethnographies and fieldwork are not possible. In terms of rapid response and with journals allowing open access publishing of papers, to see this work coming out so fast and getting such fast global response. I remember in the paper I did on COVID tracing apps in Australia and Singapore, within days and weeks, there were people in contact, and I think vice versa. But part of this is trying to understand what are these different contexts of use around particularly the pandemic apps and things like COVID tracing apps. So I wanted to talk now, and just trying to stay somewhat mindful of time, perhaps for the next 5 minutes, about the Singaporean kind of context and apps and mobilities in the pandemic. Now, Singapore's a really, I think, interesting sort of jurisdiction and place for the COVID tracing apps. That Singapore came out early with this this app called Trace Together, and I've got a screenshot of it here from its website of people, sort of different people interacting with their mobile phones, and there's the ad now saying, well, on the website, join over 90% of people in Singapore stopping the spread of COVID-19 through community-driven contact tracing. So the original idea was this Bluetooth protocol in the Trace Together app that then, when you're in contact with people and you pass the data using the Bluetooth protocol, it could then come up as an alert. So this happens now, right, in Singapore and probably across a lot of other countries. The Bluetooth is enabled. In Australia, that didn't go so well, although it was supposed to be a national, absolute national service and increasing thing to do. And it'd be intriguing to hear stories from other countries around this. So in Singapore, what happened is actually Trace Together joined together with the QR entry app, which had been widely used. And so they're a kind of omnibus app now that are used in Singapore. Okay, but what actually was really interesting, perhaps, in terms of the mobilities thread to this, is that, and also in terms of thinking around the non-media centric aspects of things, in that for many people still, even in a so-called smart nation, Singapore, which is the government's aspiration, but a sort of tiny city state where there is good connectivity and many people are on reasonable incomes and can afford the latest mobile phones. For many demographics, there still wasn't such an easy thing to do, to get a QR, to get your app up and then to check in. So Singapore actually developed these Trace Together tokens, and I've got a screenshot here of an older gentleman with one of these tokens. And so you can just rock up with these and use those to check in. And so they're particularly framed for the elderly, but they're used by a range of other people as well. For instance, blind users who are negotiating the new kind of spaces with the pandemic, right, where some aspects of public space might be closed down and you have to be directed through check-in portals or get temperature testing. And then it's hard to perhaps orient yourself to find the kind of, to do the QR code. This was before it was able to be done on a sensor. So, they're one group who've availed themselves of the token, but I have as well, and lots of colleagues have found it a lot more, and friends have found it a lot easier to use. Okay, so that's a kind of general sense in Singapore, some of, the importance of the, what's been the kind of importance of the apps. But I want to talk specifically about migrant workers in Singapore and some of the differential kind of use of apps there. So people probably, I suppose, many would be aware that Singapore situation about March, April last year, there's a huge surge of cases, and they were associated with migrant workers, particularly the men from different South Asian countries who live in the dormitories. And I've got a shot here from a report from June this year saying Singapore's migrant workers have endless interminable lockdowns. It's taking a toll on their mental health. So there was a whole public outcry and discussion about the incidents that was coming from migrant workers being crowded together in dormitories. And then what was clear in that, and what's remained clear, is that their mobility has been severely hampered. The idea that whether it's domestic workers in the Singaporean context, the female domestic workers or the male workers who are typically in the dormitories could go out on a Sunday. And for a long time, particularly while the female domestic workers are starting to be able to do that, the male workers are not doing so. So I've got another screenshot here, an article from April 2021. So when there was another kind of burst of infections, it's got the minister, Josephine Teo, Minister for Manpower, touring a dormitory room for workers and say the headline, Singapore quarantines about 1,200 migrant workers. So I think part of this, in the year that passed, one of the themes was that Singapore had given more space. They'd re-engineered the dormitories, and perhaps we're looking at the recommendations and taking them seriously of a government inquiry 2 years ago, which recommended such things. So the bit about apps, which I think is under research, and I've not done research on this either, but it's something I think is important, would like to do, is about the different kinds of apps. So that the Trace Together app is a kind of general app, general user app that people might be using. But for many groups, including migrant workers, and I think this has its parallels around the world with different apps as well, there are other work pass apps. So I've got a screenshot here from the website on the Singapore Work Pass. And so what you can do there, you check if your work pass is valid, then you can check if foreign workers can leave their residences for work. And so you can leave your residence for work and you get an access code. So you can go out for work and it gives you infection as well. These are widely used actually in various ways. And I think we've just been visiting friends who have farm properties out here in rural New South Wales, and they have an app, a kind of a farm app that organises a lot of their work, but it also keeps track of workers and their COVID-19 check-ins as well, particularly if they've got a lot of seasonal workers or backpackers who are a bit thin on the ground, actually, it turns out at this stage. So I think in Singapore, the use of apps is quite differential, actually, in terms of how this works. Okay, so just in the sort of second last section of the talk, and I will be starting to skirt the time here, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about disability and mobility in apps. So it's a sort of slight shift. But we might start actually by thinking about disabilities and mobilities and movement and migration, right? So in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, there's actually an article on personal mobility, and it's about the freedom of movement within states and about across states. Now, there's something of a body of work on disability and migration, but it's actually not huge. I wrote a chapter about this in the 2005 book I did on disability in Australia, about migration into Australia, and that people with disabilities were not often being allowed to bring family members in or migrate, and the health criteria in the Migration Act was used, in kind of against them and leading to sort of tragic events. So this is a kind of an interesting area, and I think it's not one where the digital media piece has been brought in as well. So I think this is really kind of an interesting and important area of mobility's justice too. So you think about the experience of the pandemic's caused many of us to feel our mobility is constricted, and we have new kinds of immobilities. But for many people with disabilities, immobility is a common experience, because of the barriers in built environment and the lack of accessibility. So there's a lot more to be said in that, and there's some Katie Ellis and I have been writing in our series of papers on COVID-19 disability and communication about some of the use of apps by people with disabilities in the pandemic and some of the difficulties there. But I just wanted to kind of leave with perhaps a more speculative and suggestive thing that's very influenced by being on panels recently with some colleagues in the Inter-Asian Cultural Studies Conference, which is actually in a few weeks' time in Singapore, and particularly Shilpa Anand and my colleague Victor Shuang, who I work on with Singaporean disability issues. And so it's a question about around the new subjects of disabilities and immobilities in COVID and migration. So I think Shilpa Anand particularly articulates this issue that there's a range of new or liminal disability subjects evident in the pandemic. And you think here are some of the movements we might kind of have seen in the pandemic, or particularly I think in a number of Indian scholars have written about the great kind of migration early on in the pandemic of workers back to their villages from the city, and then some of the issues that really posed. So I think particularly around disability and immobilities, there's the kind of invisibility of disability, and not maybe seeing issues through a health lens, but not so much through a disability lens. Yet we have this situation of pandemic where there's a range of issues for migrant and foreign workers, workers in precarious employment and careers, care workers and domestic workers, and others as well. And I think there's a bunch of people whose experiences are not well captured or left out of the frame of social model, human rights, and other accounts of disability, particularly those that are more centered in global North disability studies and theories. And it'd be interesting here to think of from a digital media perspective as well, this whole dislodging and rethinking of theory and research from an internationalizing and cosmopolitan perspectives. And scholars have turned to accounts of what's called debility, especially as theorized by Jasmine Poir, as deeply entangled in the power relations and inequalities of disability as one way to unpack these kind of features of social life, especially as laid bare in the pandemic. So to just give you a bit of a feel for this, perhaps, you think about, you know, the invisible disabilities of those living in the aftermath of contracting the virus, evident in the public and media fascination with the untangling and telling the stories of those with long COVID. Think of the area of mental health and illness and psychosocial disabilities, which we hear about on a daily basis, whether that's directly as a sort of outcome of COVID-19 or the issues around distancing and spatiality. And then I think a bunch of other kind of issues. So I'll just sort of conclude now because I'm sure I'm well. Yes, please wrap up. That's me. So I suppose what I just wanted to try and cover was to try and think out aloud a bit about apps and about mobilities and migration in the pandemic, and to you know, be thinking about and, you know, very interested to hear what the research that's going on around apps in this kind of context, and my particular interests, I suppose, around some of the apps that are involved in regulation and surveillance. And then to, I suppose, to speak about and draw attention to and think about some of the ways in which the emerging scholarship, I think, on disability and mobilities, of which there's a small body of work, and then I think disability and digital media can be brought together, particularly if we're thinking about new areas from the pandemic or perhaps new subjects of disability and debility. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing any thoughts and questions you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Gerard, for that very engaging and really critical work on understanding and just mapping, you know, this kind of like scaffolding of digital communication technologies in the context of, for example, migration, but also unpacking, particularly in the case of Singapore, and looking at, you know, the perspective of, you know, not only with mobilities as the use of technology, but also those immobilities that being kind of like feeling stuck in a place or being surveilled by the government in that particular space. And also that I really like the idea of unpacking this idea, you know, the invisible disabilities that are emerging, you know, in our society right now, wherein we have people having those the COVID, being positive with COVID, but also recovering, and, you know, kind of like navigating the tension of, you know, the fear of might be getting it again, and also using technologies as a form of, you know, tracking their care for themselves and also for surveillance. Now I'm opening the floor to anyone who has a question to our keynote speaker. You can just speak or you can type the question in our chat box. Anyone to ask Gerard? If not, I can actually ask Gerard for a quick question. So maybe our participants are still thinking about the question. I'm just curious, Gerard, because we talk about this idea of digital media use to enact this kind of like form of, like you mentioned, the mapping of care with digital media use. And there's a lot of actually studies about, you know, use of technologies for self-care, you know, sustaining interpersonal care practices and stuff like that. But I wanted to kind of like just tease out this aspect of surveillance happening in the digital media use, but also, for example, for those who got the COVID and recovering, and then you have people who might be fearing for their lives that you actually have the COVID, you might infect me because I don't have the vaccine or something like that. And what could possibly the role of technology in creating that immobility that, oh, I can't move. I opt to stay put or to just stay at home because I have the technology, or I can actually just be moving around particular spaces because of the, you know, considering the my care for others to not infect them, or just really thinking about the government might be following me in different kind of like spaces.
Yeah, thanks very much, Urban, and thanks also for your careful listening to the talk in what you said earlier as well. Yeah, I think it's a really crucial area, right? And for us to think about what are these different facets of this of these kind of experiences and in different contexts. I mean, knowing some, it's great to be here and seeing many, you know, friends and a whole bunch of other people here in different contexts at the moment. So I'm conscious everyone is in a particular context, right? So that whether that, you know, part of the experience about digital media has been down more the extreme end, of the surveillance and regulation aspect, right? So that if you're doing a stay-at-home notice, as I'll get to do, soon, you might be wearing the wristband or other, in some ways, or more technology associated with prisons that then gets repurposed for the kind of COVID experience. Or this more capillary-like, I think, use of apps, which I think is part of this, generating an enormous amount of data with this combination of the kind of QR code, like old technology being repurposed, and then Bluetooth kind of technologies. And that's become woven into this reconfiguration of mobilities in other ways. And it seems to me that one of the concepts from mobilities at the intersection of mobilities research and communication research, the particular Canadian scholars were talking about a few years ago, was differential mobilities. That this does seem very differential. And I think part of the diverse perspectives that you get, I think, around disability and coming from disability research is some of those aspects, right? There's clearly kind of mobility justice aspects to this. And then there's communicative aspects to this. So how does this then relate perhaps to some of the shifting modes and infrastructures, modalities of care, which was the other thing. That seems a very large topic to think about as well. And how, I mean, I suppose what are some of those, I mean, perhaps now we're seeing a whole bunch of different like everyday instances of care and aspects of care, which I think there is a support for social and mobile media for that cut across, that are in friction. They're entangled, isn't that one of the key words for the workshop, right? In some of these other systems of perhaps control and surveillance. So what are those kind of frictions that go on? And then what are some of the organized systems of care now as well? So I hope that responds in some ways to you. I think your great question.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gerard. So for those who just joined the session, just a reminder, please mute your microphone so the speakers won't be distracted. And now I'd hand the floor to Monica to facilitate the first panel. So each presenter will be given 12 minutes. And then after all the presenters in that panel, we'll have the Q&A for around 19 minutes. So we have time for the Q&A and conversation in relation to the papers. Okay, Monica.
Thank you, Irvin. I will just quickly introduce the first speaker will be Chitra Amelia. And Chitra's right there. She's got her camera on. You may see my name there as well, but I will not be speaking. Chitra is a PhD candidate at Deakin, and myself, Alistair, and Ramon is just here to support her. And so I will leave it to Chitra from Deakin to introduce her paper. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for Monica for your introductions, and also thank you for the organizer, and also thank you for everyone for attending this session. I would like to share my screen now. Can all of you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for all. And in this opportunity, I would like to sharing my preliminary findings, a part of my PhD thesis on the factors affecting PhD completion progress. But for today's presentation, I only focus on how the Indonesian PhD student as temporary migrant in Australia conducted research, and whether digital media has limited or enabled them doing research during the pandemic. And well, in here, the preliminary findings of my study, I will present the preliminary findings from my study and also my self-reflection on how I conducted the research during pandemic. And I believe all of you also can relate this study to your own experience doing research during the pandemic. And for understanding the data, I would like to combine the new mobilities paradigm and positioning theory as the framework. the data in here showed how the Indonesian PhD student positioning themselves as researcher who use digital media. So how the participant research provide new ways of understanding new mobilities paradigm using positioning theory. Okay, so in this paradigm, I'm really interested in this paradigm because even back in 2016, it has predicted the global pandemic situation that we face since 2020. So in 2016, the new mobilities paradigm has proposed that this paradigm should be the new normal science to develop new theories and methods that could be applied on research on urgent global problems in here. So since then, the new mobilities paradigm has been applied in research on, for example, urban transportation, climate change. But however, until now, I could not find a study that looks on how the research has been done during pandemic by applying this paradigm. This is how this study will contribute to this paradigm. And within the new mobilities paradigm, my self-reflection on how I conducted the research can support the 6 points that new mobilities paradigm have been proposed. However, in my data, only address point only number 1, 3, and 4, and 5. So the way I'm using this paradigm is to understand for the first point is constitutive role of movement. So how I and my research participant collecting our data during pandemic, we were no longer physically moving, but we are virtually moving. And the second one, the second point is my own experience conducting research through combining online survey and online interview as different modes of mobilities. And the third point is how digital media has been used by the participants and by myself as one of the mobile methods in here. And for the fourth points relates to this mobility system that were applied as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in here, we need to change our research methods immediately and also changing research ethics that make things becomes more complex in here. And for the point number 5 in here, emerging social practice, emphasize how this also changing our social practice in doing research. For example, how the using of transport has been changed now because we were no longer need to physically travel to collect the data. And also the place for collecting the data was not in the coffee shop, for example, or where the people gathering in social event for the anthropologists as an example. And now we are moving to Zoom now for collecting our data. We were conducted research during lockdown, so most of the participants mostly at home. So we were more tolerated and expected that would be interruption from the kids, for example, or your doorbell ringing during the interview meeting, or maybe your internet could drop out in the middle of the interviews. And also we can see in here how we're building rapport to our research participant online. And in here, we can share our empathy on how the lockdown conditioned where the participant live. And for the 6th point, the point number 6 in here, how to analyzing network capital here, it means that how we enabling our online social network in recruiting our research participant by using social media. And for the positioning theory, so within this theory, what I would like to focus in here is for self-positioning in terms of situations during lockdown, and it enforced the way PhD students doing research. So the government and university have the official power here to make moral judgment on how the research should be done online, as we are under lockdown and having social distancing restriction. And next, I'm going to show to you the research progress, how I'm going to run the research in here. And in here, I begin to advertise my online survey in a Facebook group of Indonesian communities in Australia, 1 month after Australia's border were closed, and conducted follow-up interview 4 to 7 months after the initial online survey. And for the current progress, I'm still working on the data analysis. So this is still in progress of research. So next, I'm going to show to you the participants of my study. There were 111 participants who have completed the survey. And initially, we only target to collect the data only in Melbourne. But because we collected the data online, we could get the response from the Indonesian PhD students across Australia. And in here, you can see that from 111 survey participants, 65 participants agreed to have online interview, but we only selected 22 interview participants that could represent the varieties of demographic of Indonesian PhD students in Australia. Since the interview were conducted by online, we also could interview the participants who are currently studying PhD across Australia. And I'm happy to know that more than half of my participants agreed voluntarily to participate on online interview. And one of the reasons that my participant mentions that they agreed to have an interview because they were also doing a research online, so they could feel and share their empathy on my research. And so in this slide, you also can see what is interesting here. In this slide, we can see from 111 survey participants, 35 participants at data collection stage, and all of them responded negatively regarding their need to change their research methods into online as a result of COVID-19. And then we conducted follow-up interview, and 6 participants remain response negatively on doing research online. And 4 participants have changed their perception positively regarding this issue. So this is a show how their research changing, how they respond changing. And next, in this slide, I'm going to show it to you the word cloud that was generated by using NVivo from the response on the survey. This shows their modes of feeling as an effect of COVID-19. This represents 50 words that most frequently mentioned by the participants. And obviously, most of them were unhappy with the pandemic, and some of them neither happy or unhappy. And also in here, we also can see family is quite bigger in here. Family represent in here is to show it that they are working from home. So they have a family for, they have responsibility for caring for their family. And also in here, they show that they need to adapting their data collection since the Australia border was closed, and they cannot do the field work, and it made them difficult and delayed their research progress. We can see there's a keyword in here, delayed and field work. And for the next one, I am going to show it to you also the word cloud that specifically showed how COVID-19 affect their data collection. And this word clouds in here, you can see that data collection related to face-to-face interview changed to online, and they cannot do field work as most of them need to go to field work to Indonesia. And so all must be changed to online now, which they think that will be difficult. And now we will look how the response of the participant changed over time. And from this slide, you can see how the participant changed his response over time. So to understand the data, again, I'm going to apply new mobilities paradigm and positioning theory, as I mentioned before. So this reflects how participant perspective on doing research online are temporary, and the positioning of the participant on this issue can be changed from unhappy to happy responses. And this response indicated the changing of the role of movement. It seems like he was immobile physically, but actually he used digital media as online method to enable him to be digitally mobile. As Indonesians researcher highly value of face-to-face interview than online, we can see how the respondent in here changing negatively on the survey. He showed here that he was being enforced to make some amendments on his ethics. We can see here how the power of institution has enforced the positioning of a researcher. But however, he responded positively on the interview. He could accept the changes all must be online, and his supervisor reassured him that online is still the same. This shows that social practice of how research should be doing, should be doing in here, that the social practice has changed also. So in here, because the supervisor mentioned is still the same, that it is just like a kind of recognition that online interview will give the similar result as a face-to-face interview, and even better now, as we don't need to think about the travel costs, and also easier to arrange the schedule online and make everything done faster. And next, I'm going to show it to you the key variables that further, I would like to explore this key variable, whether the demographic participants have affected their responses on how doing research online by using digital media during the pandemics in analyzing the data. And the last is I'm going to show it to you the summary of preliminary findings of my study. So the first summary is in here, that the finding from the survey showed that all participants who conducted a research during COVID-19 responded negatively regarding the changing methods of data collection into online from the survey. And this suggests that most Indonesian species highly value face-to-face interaction in collecting data as part of cultural dimension in the society. And that became a challenge issue with the COVID-19, as they need to avoid face-to-face interaction and change it into online. So like it all or not, all must be online now. And the second summary is some of their perceptions and practice have changed rapidly over time, as can be seen from the interview data that shows that they become more positively in accepting this condition. And the third summary here, during the pandemic, digital media has enabled them to collect the data without need to move physically. And the last one is digital media has become a blessing in disguise for this participant. This was also very cultural and religious, specifically to Indonesian students. And also we have a paper on this issue regarding the online supervision, and maybe we can share it when it has already published later. And I think that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much. And I will hand over to Ibu Monica. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chitra. We will move on to the next speakers. Another colleague of ours, Michelle Logo from Deakin University, as well as Kaya Bari from Aalborg University and Michelle Duffy from the University of Newcastle. I will let Michelle know when it is about 3 minutes to go via chat. So if that's okay, Michelle, I'll let you know when you're near the end. Thank you very much. I will let you and Kaya and Michelle introduce your paper. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming. This paper is with Kaya Barry and Michelle Duffy. Michelle, you want to say hello? It's called Letters and Postcards, Materializing and Digitizing Immobile Entanglements. It's a performative paper, so I'm going to just share the screen and Irvin will do that. Thanks very much. And we look forward to your questions.
Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, I'll play now the video.
Yes, yes, we can see the video also. Yeah.
Yes.
When COVID-19 pandemic immobilities stretch or shrink time space and circulate anxiety, contact-free, drop-off, express, and next-day delivery parcels materialize the promise of joy. But these hypermobile gifts that satisfy our desire for consumption also entangle us in the plurality of time spaces of exploitation, extraction, and extinction that accelerate ecological crises. Eduarda Cohen therefore invites us to give modest gifts that nourish the flourishing of living futures. These gifts open our thinking to the realization of a greater us that is both here and over there. In this paper, we experiment with these modest gifts through the collective process of crafting, writing, and posting letters as well as cards over a period of 4 months between the Australian coastal cities, Newcastle, Melbourne, and Brisbane. It is a joyful experience to craft and post gifts to Kaya and Michelle. I crease time with origami figures of birds and butterflies, shade time through botanical sketches, press deep time through impressions of corals and fossiliferous rocks from India. Oh no, have I produced a plastic lummet? I also trace holes in time in an anti-stress nature dot-to-dot coloring book. Scrape and sprinkle the colorful intensity of time with bright red sandstone from the Grand Canyon. This enthusiasm for crafting time, space, matter strengthens with our exchanges. There is joy as well as pain parting with postcards that show a stippled green, yellow, red saltwater crocodile and a cross-hatched white, brown, and red ocean painted by Indigenous artists from the Bagot Aboriginal town camp in Darwin. The small blue card arrives, a gift from icy worlds that does not get lost in time as it moves through the sorting machines at the post office. Cheerful seals, diving penguins, and a partially immersed bear from the Arctic mingle polar worlds. I pore over the small card. Tea spills, colors mingle, and my wooden desk is transformed by the blueness of the icy water. A tea stain makes a brown arc in the ocean. Michelle invites me on a comic adventure by winging away a card showing Moomentron tending to a delicate plant. Bright yellow letters shout out, I only want to live in peace and plant potatoes and dream. Moomentron looks like a hybrid being, neither human or animal, but human animal, and has traveled from Helsinki, Finland to a bookshop in Newcastle, then in a car moving at breakneck speed across the New South Wales Victoria border before it closed in December. Kaya's colorful artworks echo beauty, mobility, and infrastructural time. The sky with stratused clouds and the rippling river in shades of grey and white seem to merge in the line cut of the Brisbane Riverside Expressway. The cement bridge is alive with light and speeding cars. When I turn the car upside down, I see chimneys oozing toxic smoke and fly ash. Are those subterranean pipelines transporting offshore gas? Anishna Beckway plant scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer asks us to give unique gifts to the earth and to live in a way that the earth will be grateful for us. Wow, a hand-drawn brown teapot and a lockdown bench has arrived. Talk about having that materials of time. We were curious that while we were on the whole trapped in our homes because of COVID, mail and parcels were free to travel, and that the materials, the objects that we send and receive, appear to be more mobile than ever before. And this, we thought, troubles the temporalities, mobilities, and immobilities that many in a privileged world take for granted. Our choice of sending letters to each other was inspired by two things. Kaya's postcard mobilities project, beautiful postcards Kaya has made and then sends out to interested people across the world to see how long they took to reach their individual destinations. And Nick Bangtok's Griffin and Sabine books, with the first volume subtitled An Extraordinary Correspondence, published in 1991. In these books, you see their scribblings, maps, imagined animals, the impress of postal marks on detailed images. And you get to share the thrill of the story's protagonists as they open their correspondence, because you as the reader get to open envelopes embedded within the pages and read the letters that were sent and delivered. Today's presentation is a performance created around our acts of writing and receiving letters. And in many ways, it has links to the work of sensory ethnographies proposed by Sarah King, in that, as she has written, such an approach offers a way to explore vision and touch that are part of a tacit and understanding of and engagement with everyday worlds and issues. But our performance of writing and receiving letters is also infused by non-representational practices. As Hayden Lorimer explains, the focus falls on how life takes shape and gains expression in shared experiences, everyday routines, fleeting encounters, embodied movements, precognitive triggers, practical skills, affective intensities, enduring urges, unexceptional interactions, and sensuous dispositions. In preparing for this performance, we mapped our variously scaled worlds of this intense and curtailed period. Each of us in our homes selected card, postcard, or paper, and set about capturing in those pages our interests, thoughts, and questions that day. And upon reflection, we kept returning somehow to entanglements of movement and stasis. For example, Michelle sends a dot-to-dot image of a buck with magnificent antlers emerging out of the lines that follow a sequence of numbers. An image surrounded by bursts of handwritten reflections, including the suggestion that perhaps this emergent image corresponds to the ways in which materiality and temporality unfold, and ends with a characteristic sense of rush and speed as Michelle signs off to pursue another activity, another movement across and through space. Kaya sends a postcard she's created that incorporates an early coronavirus travel information sign from Singapore Airport, writing on the back of the card, "I love the scales in it. Aircraft larger than the earth, viruses," or she asks, "Are they stars, fireworks?" And she ends with, "Thought it is a great emblem for my dreams of one day jetting off again in an airplane." And Michelle's map of a place she knows well, Kolkata, her description recreating her movements and memories in the static diagram of the map. As she writes, "I know so well many walks." Perhaps it's a sketch of the infrastructure that materializes time and embeds us in the bitumen, bridges, and parks, and encourages me to enjoy. Mobility and immobility. In creating our letters, the materials we use, the beautiful drawings and artwork that Kaya sent, with stamps and postal markings on the envelope she'd received from us,
gorgeous images of blue water in the print, the unexpectedness of Michelle's use of materials other than a pen, instead plants, rock, the impression of a fossil in delightful and surprisingly vivid orange plastic. These also set up micro-mobilities as they trace and move across paper, alongside the movement of our hands as we write, as we set out to transcribe our thoughts into something legible. No, perhaps something tangible, for as Kaya writes to me at one time, I read your handwriting, but I take care to decipher the letters at times. So our writing often borders on the edge of legibility. We're less used to writing by hand, perhaps, out of practice, and we can't always quite make out what the other is wanting to communicate. But perhaps this captures more accurately the miscommunicated, the misheard, the misread of everyday life. Taking care also means attending to details that I hadn't really considered before. I'm surprised how we see and feel the impact of mobility in and on our letters. The traces of that movement as our thoughts and ideas are written, inscribed, scribbled and drawn onto paper. But also the traces of our correspondence as it travels through Australia's posts, numerous sorting and delivering processes. This is especially brought to my attention by Kaya's focus on process. In one letter to me, she recreates the koala stamp on the header of the page, as well as the blurred postmark of black ink that were present on an envelope she'd received from Michelle. So I start to attend to the passages of travel borne by envelopes and postcards, the trails of damaged paper left by snails when I've left my mail in the letterbox too long, or the splatter of rain that blurs the light blue ink on a postcard that doesn't quite hide its message.
Thank you for that. Is that the performance, your presentation, Michelle? Just double checking. Yeah. Okay,
Thank
wonderful. Okay, so we will continue on to the third paper by Professor J. Marlowe at University of Auckland and Gemma Allen, the same University of Auckland. And I will leave it to you to introduce your paper, and I will message Jay when it's about 3 minutes to go. Thank you very much. We'll leave the question to after.
Great, thank you. Just want to confirm you can see the presentation on the screen. Yep. So tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Hello and welcome from New Zealand, and certainly sending my thoughts to Australian colleagues who hopefully will emerge from a worrying situation relatively soon. I'm a associate professor of social work at the University of Auckland and co-director for the Center for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies. And I'm co-presenting this with a colleague who's not here, who's Gemma Allen, and she's currently doing a PhD within our school. And we are presenting this idea of relationality and online interpersonal research, and I think particularly follows on very well from Citra's presentation, and that we find ourselves in the situations of pandemic immobility and people having to shift gears very quickly, research ethic committee having to respond to research designs that are now online, and witnessing the use of Zoom, I think from 2019 in December to 2020 in December, had increased more than 30-fold. So what are the ethical and methodological and pragmatic implications of that? And so I'll be bringing in some of my work at a relatively high level as a migration scholar, refugee studies scholar, to inform that. So this is a report from the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 2016, which the green and blue dots, the red dots show the main sites of dislocation where people are forcibly displaced. And the green and blue dots show where there's mobile 2G, 3G connectivity, meaning that refugees can now be connected in ways that wasn't previously possible, though those red dots show where it's not possible. So it shows that this remains uneven, but yet the affordability, the usability, the availability of these communication technologies is increasing, opening new opportunities for people to interact across time and space through these tools. And we see this proliferation of apps, and Jared's already spoken to a number of these different apps, and Raylene Wilding has referred to these as offering different types of intimacies. So that might be visual, audio, text-based, synchronous, asynchronous, and that all these different platforms provide particular affordances and limitations to the ways in which we interact. And that's also the case within the research space. And it's meant that in some cases, particularly with COVID, that it's accelerated the use of these platforms without adequate time to actually think about what might be the implications of conducting research on these platforms and what might that mean for relationality. So some of the things that starts to emerge, I mean, they talk about this idea of decontextualization. That certainly for me, I've done a number of transnational studies now where I've engaged with people from refugee backgrounds in other countries, or you understand how people are engaging with transnational networks using online methods. Something that Longhurst has referred to as sort of disrupting the somatic rhythm. But we also see this idea that it can also disembody research as well, and that the sort of the real embodiment of people and objects in real time through the absence of embodied experience, the exclusion of touch, smell, and taste from the relational experience. And yet, in some ways, it isn't, these disembodied experiences aren't totally flattened, and that actually encourage you to think about that in other ways. And so alongside this, we also see this literature that talks about a lot of the technical considerations of engaging in the online space. So that's from sort of calls dropping, batteries going flat to devices having storage in them, time lag displays, low bandwidth, device capacity. And even you start to see things around what should you have in your virtual background, right? So I've got a picture of Grandfather Mountain, which is the mountain that I'm from in North Carolina, even though I'm in New Zealand. And so even being aware of kind of what it is that we present. But some of the things that we started to develop a worry about was that we started seeing what almost looked like a tick box list of things of thou shalt. Thou shalt be so many inches away from your webcam. You should only use these certain platforms. And we actually argue that when you seek to create a rigidly controlled environment where online spaces are overly curated, the real world of the virtual may be lost. And actually, if you allow for that real world of the virtual to happen, which might include pixelated images and poor verbal, poor audio quality, these are the things that have happened in my research. But what it meant was that I started doing platform hopping with participants, and we started to innovate and trying to find ways to actually interact. And this actually established a relationship that actually gave a real insight into people's everyday lives and their worlds. So, so from that, we sort of reject that checklist approach to doing this sort of work and forward a virtual material positional perspective that centers relational reflexive practice. And drawing on the work of Morrow, they say if we refuse to see the online researcher as a floating, disembodied subject or an isolated individual in front of a computer screen, and recognize that the online research viewpoint is in fact a view from somewhere, then we might begin to develop critical perspectives on what we might call virtual material positionality. And so to really recognize that importance of our own intersectionality of power and privilege, and that these interactions aren't just flattened into a 2D space. They actually are embodied, they are contextualized, and we need to recognize those things. And so to take that another step and along and in congruence with sort of that feminist literature, Patricia Luna wrote about this idea of the vulnerability concept as needing to be understood as a layered concept as opposed to a label. A label is indelibly, you're either vulnerable or you're not. And in some cases for refugees, for instance, yes, there are considerations of vulnerability, but they are not indelibly vulnerable. That we as researchers can either add layers of vulnerability or we can even take away layers of vulnerability if our designs are responsive and aware of the situations in which people are living their lives and the wider context around them. And so Jim and I extend that to think about not just about the vulnerability concept, but actually that in this online interpersonal space that it has methodological, ethical, and pragmatic layers. and that we as researchers can either sort of add layers that make us more ethically responsive, that make these more pragmatically feasible and accessible, and also more methodologically rigorous. And so what I want to conclude with probably what's only about 5 minutes left or something like that, is I just want to present sort of 6 principles that, that we don't think are mutually exclusive, but we will present them as discrete particulars and just sort of highlight some of the questions that, that actually emerge from that. So the first is know the setting, device, and communication platform. So because these things actually have pragmatic or relational, methodological, and ethical communication implications. So if we think about communication, what online platforms and communication devices do people you want to engage with, what do they actually use? Or are you actually introducing a foreign platform to them? What communication devices are appropriate or necessary for your study? How do these choices affect the quality of data collection? What relational affordances do these create and potentially inhibit? Do participants have access to a particular application to participate? Are they familiar with it? Does it require training to use effectively? If we look at the legislative environment, I mean, for me particularly, where I'm working across in the transnational space, what privacy legislation might inform your research in addition to institutional ethics protocols? What implications are there for researching across national borders or jurisdictions? And then just follow the research setting. Do participants have to speak to you alone? Can they be multitasking? And in fact, again, if we're asking them to speak alone, are we actually erasing the real world of the virtual in some ways? What are the implications for your research and participants' choice of location? And how do these selections impact considerations of safety, confidentiality, quality of data, and well-being? The second principle is promoting well-being and thinking about digital disclosures. Will you use a virtual background? Or what of your life will you choose to show to participants? What are you looking to communicate about yourself and your attempts to build rapport? What digital traces of your own exist across the internet? Have you searched this for yourself? What might the implications be of these presentations? We think about safety. How will you respond to someone who becomes distressed? Within social work, we sometimes talk about this idea of embracing silences. And how do you establish those relationships and rapport? How do you embrace silences in these online spaces? Does this in some ways change the ways that we interact? The third principle is about sort of maintaining that rapport. And so how might rapport building be affected by your choice of platform? What contextual information helps to build rapport across geographic distance? How might things like time zone, political events, holidays, climate, weather, other significant events need to be attended to? And I'm just kind of racing along because I've gotten a warning that I need to move along. But the fourth principle is, I think, is a particularly important one, which is establish what is data. And thinking about within the online environment, what do you have consent to observe and inquire? Are you allowed to ask me about that mountain that sits behind me? Does that relate to your research question? Is that acceptable? If I take off that virtual background and one of my children walks behind, are you allowed to ask about them? And can you incorporate aspects of their everyday that sit behind that video or audio-based interaction? And then finally, just those digital traces. What are some of the possible digital traces that are left behind on communication platforms? And what are the surveillance risks? The refugee studies stuff that I've done. I mean, sometimes people are talking about political activism, and other scholars have written about what they call extraterritorial authoritarian aggressions. So how are informed consent, data privacy, participant safety affected by the platform that you use? Interestingly, I was actually recording a conversation, and I actually had a child who had no clothes on walk behind me, and this was actually recorded in that session. It was Southern Night Right. I mean, at least I was the one that was recording it. But if you capture that data, what do you do with it? Do you have to erase that video? We suddenly find ourselves in spaces where ethics committees haven't even considered the implications of these things at the speed at which it's moved. My last two, and then I'll stop. Principle 5 is addressing digital inequality, and that's an issue that provokes ethical concern about both bias and burden. So, thinking about how the online environment related to people's availability, the usability, the accessibility of digital interaction, who's excluded from that, how might you use an intersectional lens to inform that, and how might you reduce those barriers to improve access? And then just finally, and obviously all these intersect, is ensuring ethics in practice. The procedural ethics, the stuff that we often do to get approval from ethics committees to do research, is only what gets us through those initial gates. But the twists and turns of research means that we need to be responsive to those things, and that informed consent in that online space might need to be renegotiated. How do we deal with digital disruptions? And can we be dexterous? Do we have approval to go from Zoom to WhatsApp, to Viber, to Messenger? Do we need to go back to ethics committees for those things? Do we need to understand where the data is stored? Is there voice recognition on these things? How does all that work? And then finally, I think just this idea of working relationally, and I'll stop, is just that is even think about this our relationship to the environment, environmental justice. That this last study that I did had 55 interviews, and I looked at if I'd flown as opposed to using digital methods, the average CO2 release would have been 350 kilograms of carbon per interview. And about 1 hour of high definition video streaming, is about 1.1 kilograms an hour. So it makes it a differential of just one study of about 20,000 kilograms of carbon. So thinking about those wider considerations as well, and an opportunity to engage in those things in relational ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. So we are scheduled to have about 17 minutes of question and answer time. We have gone a bit past the 2:21 start for the panel, but I will take 3 questions for now, and then we'll see how we go. And the next session would be at 2:50, if I'm not mistaken, Irvin. Well, we're going to take a break, but we may go a little bit over that. So if anyone has a question.
Okay, so I hope we're all back now, so we can start our next panel for today's workshop. But before we start, here the presentation of our keynote speaker. I'll introduce him first, and then we'll give him 20 minutes to present, and then we'll have a question and answer after his presentation. So our second keynote speaker is an assistant professor in media, gender, and post-colonial studies in the grad gender program at the Department of Media and Culture of Utrecht University, the Netherlands. So his research lines revolve around digital technologies, migration, youth, gender, and innovative digital and participatory methods. Recently, he won the Evans Foundation Award for his project Critical Media Literacy Through Making Media, a key to participation for young migrants, a participatory action research project which involved 250 plus young newcomers and their teachers from 2017 to 2019. I hope that's correct. So he co-edited the Sage Handbook of Media and Migration in 2020 and journal Special Issues on Digital Migration in Popular Communication and Social Media and Society. And in 2015, he published the Digital Passages Migrant Youth 2.0 under Amsterdam University Press. His second monograph is coming out in 2022. That would be Digital Migration Studies. So today's presentation is entitled Historicizing the Technopolitics of Immobilities. Please welcome our second keynote speaker, Cohen viewers.
Thank you very much, Irvin, and very grateful to be here. Thanks for the smooth organization and running of the workshop. It's a pleasure to take part. So I'm also delighted to share my ongoing work with you here today. And this talk is very much based on an argument and empirical material that I'm still developing. It's partly also co-conducted with my colleague Philip Söferling, who's based at Södertörn University. I'm looking forward to any comments and feedback you might have. So in the last decade, I've engaged mostly in ethnographic fieldwork and participatory action research and interviews, particularly with young people of migrant and refugee and expatriate backgrounds. And most recently with my colleague Mireille Georgiou at the London School of Economics. And we've started to reflect on the role of personal digital archives, such as smartphones and personal profile pages. And we're trying to think through the material and affective and also symbolic dimensions of these archives, reacting on selected materials that informants have shared with us over the course of our fieldwork. For example, you see here an image shared by Patricia, a 15-year-old girl from Aleppo, Syria, who is into badminton and piano. And during our interview, she shared a manipulated photo from her archive depicting herself and her 1.5 months old baby sister. It was one of the pictures dearest to her heart. It signifies a period of living in separation from her loved ones. And she uses Snapchat to maintain a lifeline with her grandparents and best friends still living in Syria. Jack shared an image. Jack, a 16-year-old Syrian young Dutchman, shared an image of his backpack, a manipulated photo representing his desire to be seen not as a refugee, but as a regular person in the street. And finally, we see an image of a 70-year-old Syrian Dutch Mohammed, who is into horse riding and rap. And he discussed videos he received from his loved ones still living in Syria, showing how his street was bombarded. So for him, his phone consists of an important record to cope with trauma and share with others personal stories of the impact of the civil war. And so we've been doing this kind of engaged face-to-face field work for a prolonged period. And then the pandemic hit, which also for me coincided with a fellowship at the National Institute of the Advanced Studies at Amsterdam, but working from home. And as a result of many discussions with historians there, particularly historians of colonial cartography and oral history, I began to stray away from original plans to write this monograph that Irvin so generously mentioned already in the introduction on digital migration studies, to think more about pre-histories of migration, how early histories and early archives of migration might tell us more, also to think up through the contemporary relationships between technologies and migration, between the digital and migration. So how can we think about pre-digital histories of these interrelationships is a question that I'd like to explore here. So in the last half year, partly also resulting from difficulties of encountering and collaborating with informants face-to-face, so during the pandemic, I sought for other means to have meaningful encounters. And I delved into records of elite and subaltern migration in the Dutch colonial era. And I had encounters which actually felt eerily similar to some of the inspiring, confrontational, moving, and difficult encounters I've had during fieldwork, doing face-to-face ethnographic research. So negotiating access, talking with gatekeepers, finding and stumbling upon unexpected results, insights, and data, for example. So despite all of the praise of digital humanities and remote digital access to sources, I found that alongside a wealth of these digital resources, many more interesting, fine-grained and kind of non-mainstream materials not yet scanned, not yet digitally accessible, which also says a lot already about canonizing in the digital era of the digital record. So in the last months, I've been able to access the following more institutional archives. And I have to say these, of course, allow one to research a particular history, which is centralized, which is a state and very much a colonial vision on saving historical records. So as a result of the COVID pandemic, it was difficult to access the non-institutionalized, the community, the personal archives, which is also what I hope to do when measures ease also here. But realizing the limits of the archive, the archives that I was looking at, so the National Archive, the International Institute of Social History, as well as the Dutch Museum of Sound and Vision, all based in the Netherlands, was really a starting point, which drew on established drawing on established critical archival studies, we can reflect on those limits to make also kind of generative encounters with these archives. And for this purpose, I sought tools to address the hegemony, which is embedded in institutional archives, and means to locate also how in these kind of hegemonic archival records, we can also trace and find back forms of contestation, of negotiation from below. So here I particularly drew inspiration from the work of the political scientist and anthropologist James Scott and the feminist and post-colonial anthropologist and historian Anne Stoler. So Scott's Domination and the Arts of Resistance offers the analytic pair of the public and the hidden transcript as tools to scrutinize archives and to go behind the official story. He argues, I quote, that every subordinate group creates out of its ordeal a hidden transcript that represents a critique of power spoken behind the back of the dominant, end quote. So by assessing the discrepancy between the hidden transcript and the public transcript, we may begin to judge the impact of domination on public discourse. From Weapons of the Week and the other book, Seeing Like a State, we can understand the interplay in archival renderings of top-down vision and bottom-up forms of contestation. And from Stoller, we can take cues of what it means to read along and read against archival grains, and to address the unquote colonial duress or the colonial presence in the present. How those colonial ideologies, for example, still circulate and shape present moments. So from this note on archival research and note on theories that I'm touching upon here. So overall, I'm focusing on the technopolitics of mobility and immobility, and I want to develop a historical perspective on the kind of pre-digital relations between migration and the media. This is a framework combining science and technology, media and mobility studies, while also seeking to acknowledge continuities and the hauntings of historical colonial formations. So from the perspective of media studies, as John Durham Peters outlined in his 2015, The Marvelous Clouds and Media Philosophy, encompassing an environment of action, the media constitutes an environment of action which organizes space and time, which means it encompasses and includes some while excluding others in this environmental space. And on this basis, we can conceive how media as an environment of action reproduce the mobilization and mobility of some and immobilization and immobility of others. This also relates to Huub Dijsselbloem's account of the technopolitics of the border. And from his science and technology studies perspective, we can take cues on how systems, assumption, and exclusions are fundamentally relational. In a similar spirit, the geographer Tim Cresswell urges to address how mobility and immobility operate as plural, as an encompassing constellation of mobility, which are very much historically and geographically specific, something that Gary Goggin earlier on also emphasized, the specificity and the contextuality of mobility. And the historical hauntings and colonial presence can be underlined following Ann Stoller's work. So having set up the methodological and conceptual approach, we can now move to the archival record. So I want to explore with you two historical genealogies of migration technopolitics on the basis of two case studies that I want to talk you through. So first, the racialized colonial politics of representation of mobility and immobility, which can be addressed on the basis of the case study of the encounters between the West Indian Film Foundation and the Association Our Suriname. And I will get back and introduce you to the context in a minute. A second case study is the gendered and racialized imaginary and infrastructures of mobility and immobility, which I'll scrutinize by studying the introduction and distribution of radio and telegraphy in the Dutch colonized contemporary Indonesia. So first, for the first case study, I'd like to sketch a little bit the historical context. I'm focusing here on the territories of Suriname and South America and the Caribbean islands of Curacao and Aruba, which were colonized by the Dutch and were part of the Dutch West India Company. So the colonization of Suriname dates from 1667 until independence in 1975. Following colonization, Curacao and Aruba are currently independent countries in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So during the Second World War, between 1940 and 1945, the Dutch government in exile began to review its relation with colonial territories and the future post-war period. At first, Dutch rulers thought it could strengthen again and pull back its reach over these overseas territories and continue colonial rule and exploitation. And I've stumbled upon fascinating material which proves an entry point to scrutinize the post-war workings of the politics of representation. The establishment of the West Indian Film Foundation is very telling how hierarchical understandings of the Dutch colonial center versus its peripheries was further to dichotomies of discursive understandings of the self versus the other. So here we see a scan of one of the founding documents of the West Indian Film Foundation. And here we can see how this was supported by the Ministry of Colonies it was oriented towards furthering cultural propaganda to degrees, I quote, the great ignorance, and it was aimed at audience both in countries about the other country. So for the Netherlands and the West, and for colonies in the West to learn more about the Netherlands. So the focus was on the image of a country, the images of populations, main lines of history, positions of the Netherlands during the Second World War, the position of the West in the world, institutional settings in both countries during and after the war. But also, and this is the number 10, why should ties between the motherland and the West be maintained in the future? So the aim was to further to establish and maintain this view of a dominance of the Netherlands over its colonial territories, here labeled as the West, in the sense of the West Indies. So how did I I studied the records on the West Indian Film Foundation. So I looked at scenarios, I looked at receptions, but I also looked at how migrant communities, the Surinamese community, responded to depictions shared in the documentaries. So there were 5 scenarios that I dug up in the archive, which are called Fishery in the Caribbean, The Battle for the Soil, Hand on the Plow, Aruba, and the Bridge of Willemstad. So these already indicate it's very much resource extraction oriented efforts. And I can point out to 2 instances to emphasize how the Netherlands sought to further its view of dominance over the West and over colonized populations. So, for example, at the bottom, the Bridge of Willemstad, I found at the end of a scenario, a handwritten note was added stating the end is little successful, more enlightenment is required. So here we can see how it is the Dutch who bring enlightenment to the colonies, further strengthening this discourse of legitimation, of domination, legitimation of Dutch ownership over overseas territories. In the scenario of the Aruba, I found how there was, within this public transcript of the documentary film scenario, there was also a hidden transcript. There was already pushback recognizable. I quote here, the Arubans would appreciate if this film expresses that the Aruban is not a savage anymore, but part of an economically viable community. The attention should be paid on social development and fishery. So here we can see in this archival record, institutional record, we could see already the interplay over the politics of representation. And we can see this further, how this was, the documentaries were received. And actually the impact of these documentaries was quite substantial in the sense that these were achieved. On the left, we see a caption from the Green Amsterdammer journalistic outlet that these documentaries received highest circulation as opening films in cinema in 1950, covering aspects such as the current problems of the Antilles and Suriname. Its aims can be distilled from those from the reception in newspapers. For example, how ministers spoke that these documentaries could internalize the relations between the royal territories, and how it could demonstrate Dutch leadership, its progress, and how it would open up the jungle of the colonies to extract its resources, but also to bring wealth to its colonial territories. And you could also distill from its depictions how the colonized populations were sketched and represented as a lazy folk who based and lived according to their primal instincts. So here we can see a lot of colonial tropes in these documentary representations. So what is now interesting is when I also found in the archives how migrant communities of Surinamese living in the Netherlands responded to those documentaries. In their monthly newsletter distributed among members of the association Our Suriname, which was an association in 1984, joined by 500 Surinamese migrants living in the Netherlands out of the estimated number of 1,500 Surinamese. So this was a well-read, well-distributed magazine. And here we could see how the person of T. Dijkstra, a female member of the board of association, in this newsletter issued a very critical response to the documentaries produced by the West Indian Film Foundation. And she speaks about how, from the insider perspective of the Surinamese, there are lots of questions to be asked about those documentaries, and that the Surinamese were disappointed in how they were depicted. So here we can already see how in those pre-digital records, we can ask questions about the politics of representation. There's a long history of speaking back to immobilizing frames and othering discourse of subordinated by the subordinated. And we could also see in the record how actually this led also to surveillance. So this is on the top right, you see I found records by the security, by the Dutch security agency, who began surveilling the activities of the Association of Our Suriname. So this raises questions and illustrates how the politics of media, politics of representation is played out in the media. And we can further follow the question of, can the subaltern speak, issued by Gayatri Spivak. So to what extent can people marginalized or dominated speak back to controlling powers? And Irvin, I see your message that we have about 5 minutes left. Is that right?
Yes, 5 minutes gone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. I'll move to the second case study, and now I'm realizing I'm racing through it, but I just also want to give impressions from the archives. So the second example second case speaks to infrastructural imaginaries of mobility and immobility, and I shift the geographical focus from the Dutch West Indies towards the so-called Dutch East Indies. So with the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch became the dominant European power in Indonesia in 1610, and Indonesia declared its independence in 45, which was recognized by the Netherlands at the end of 49. My focus is on the turn of the 19th and early decades of the 20th century, looking at the introduction of the radio and telegraphy and the telephone in Indonesia. And we can study this through looking at government and corporate plans, program guides, advertisements, and archived shows. So radio broadcasts from the Netherlands produced a sense of connected presence between the colony and the colonial center, important to sustain mobility. Simultaneously, we could also see how many competing interests, commercial, political, and indigenous interests surfaced on their colonial radio airwaves. So this became an intense site of diasporic and local exchange, contestation, and conflict. So prior to actual introduction, we could already see the strong workings of the promise of closeness, the promise of being connected migrants. For example, here we see a newspaper published in 1870, so well before the introduction of the radio, which was only in the 1930s, which was labeled as the telephone, a newspaper for the East Indies, and we can see how a person speaks into a telegraph line and receives a message at the other end. So there was this promise of becoming connected migrants, really anticipating some of the conceptualizations of the figure of the connected migrant theorized over the course of the last 15 years by Dana Diminescu, how media, particularly digital media, creates this sense of having a connected presence, being present in one's country of immigration and one's country of arrival. And I'll just briefly talk you through. So when I mentioned this aspect of that we can tease out many different workings, one of them is the aspect of the political economy. So when we, for example, look at some of the records anticipating the introduction of the radio, for example, we can see in notes taken at an Amsterdam Bank meeting in 1910, where there's talk of the establishment of a telegraphic community by means of a telegraphic connection independent from the England monopoly. Or how Philips, the director of the Philips electric engineering company, spoke about his tour of the Dutch Indies in arguing that there should be more light introduced in the Dutch Indies, so promoting the light industry of Philips, but also the radio. So he actually was one of the people behind the introduction of the first commercial radio station, the POHI private channel, which began broadcasting in Indonesia in 1927. So he created his own product there. A final additional layer that is very interesting to scrutinize is how this imaginary of connected presence was very much gendered and racialized. So we could see how this connectivity between the homeland and the East Indies was projected to be a female connection. So there were many instances of this sense of angelic connection where female bodies were used to promote this sense of connectivity, of bridging distance. And we could also see how this was also projected as a way to improve the integration of the Dutch in local Indonesian society. And this is my penultimate slide. I think one of the interesting aspects is also how we can already think about when we address pre-digital means of connectivity, to think back about how people experienced this new regained sense of intimacy, of being able to connect across distance through the radio. So this is an autobiographical account of a speaker who appeared on the radio. And this article is titled Among Fellow People, the Voice of the Motherland, which speaks about a new sense of intimacy experienced, but also how this sense of intimacy was delayed. So there is a promise of connectivity, but this promise is delayed. So with this kind of brief excursion to the archive, and sorry I've been racing through, I think it's important for us to realize how we can kind of challenge the dominant kind of exceptionalism, which is an fascination and fetishization of new technologies, which we see in plenty of media migration studies, and how we can historicize and kind of decontextualize the present by looking at prior genealogies. And in concluding, I think there's lots to learn when we look at how the post-colonial present and the colonial past, how we can trace the relationships between immobilizing stereotypes of migration, but also how in media technology, also in pre-digital media technologies, we can already trace how power and contestation were inherent to the technology, how we can think about intersectional relations of difference such as gender and race in the promise of connectivity, and how we can think about delayed presence. And I think with that, I should stop. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cohen. That was actually a very thought-provoking discussion. I have some questions in mind, but I'll let our audience first to kind of like throw in some questions for you. Is anyone from the audience who would like to ask a question to Cohen? This will be chaired by Michelle. So we have 3 presenters, and I'll let Michelle do the talking. Go, Michelle.
Yeah. So welcome, everybody. My name is Michelle Lobo, and delighted to have 3 great presentations. Our first presentation is by Tanya Arlen from University of Amsterdam, Field Events, Engaging with Digital Technologies in Ethnographic Fieldwork. So over to you, Tanya.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. And yeah, this one. Yeah, can you see that?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I'm also based in the Netherlands. I'm actually in Croatia right now. So yeah, thank you for having me at the workshop. And yeah, my apologies for being so low key in the first part of the panel, but it was very early here. So let's just move on with the presentation. So I approach today's topics of digital media and migration, and also care, which was mentioned, as an anthropologist. And the presentation that I'm going to give today is really based on my research on elder care at a distance in Indian transnational families. Now, I did this research before COVID, but it became suddenly relevant during the pandemic. Now, I initially designed this research as a multi-sided ethnographic fieldwork in India and Oman. I went to Kerala, a South Indian state, where a lot of people become nurses in order to migrate abroad and to work abroad, and then to support their families from there. And then my second field site was Oman, because that's one of the major destination countries for these nurses. And what I looked at were everyday information and communication technologies, or ICTs. So mobile phones, very basic mobile phones, but also smartphones, tablets, laptops, and so on. I looked at how these technologies actually support elder care at a distance and actually shape it, not just support it. So while I was doing this research in Kerala, I was really invited by my study participants to join their conversations with their family members abroad. And then eventually I was even invited to carry out interviews with them. And this was quite unexpected for me. I didn't plan on that. I didn't put it in my research design and so on. So, but when I was invited to do that, I realized that this was a great method to also include nurses that were living in other countries than Oman. So when I came back to academia, my colleagues started to ask me, where was your field site? Where do you do your research? And I really struggled to provide a clear answer. Of course, it was Kerala and it was Oman. That was pretty clear because I flew there by plane and I stayed in each of those locations for a few months. But then what about Canada and the UK and Australia? I conducted interviews via a webcam with the nurses living there. And then in the Maldives and the US, I interviewed the nurses living there by phone. So I realized that the term multi-sited fieldwork, in the sense of encompassing several geographic sites that could be added together by being there and there and there, this wasn't really appropriate for, to describe the kind of fieldwork that I did, because I didn't visit all those locations in person. But I also, at the same time, found terms like digital, virtual, and online ethnography. I found that they didn't really describe my field site accurately, because I was not focusing exclusively on studying websites and forums or virtual worlds as places where people socialize. What I was doing instead was incorporating information and communication technologies in my fieldwork. And I felt quite intuitively that these technologies were not just passive tools that I was using to reach my informants. So this was not simply just another way of traveling around the world. So I started asking the following questions. Question: what becomes of the field site when it is shaped by digital technologies? And to answer this question, I drew on material semiotics, which is an approach from science and technology studies. And this approach is really useful to explore what people and technologies enact together and how their identity is also shaped in the process. So this means that the agency of material objects within relations is emphasized. So the relations form not only between people, but are also formed with and shaped by objects that are therefore active and co-creating. So the material semiotic approach makes it possible to see technologies as agents which participate in co-creating fieldwork. Technologies are then not simple tools that people use to achieve certain means. So in this context, what happens to the field site? So with my colleague Fang Li, we answered this question in an article that we wrote, where instead of referring to a field site, we proposed the notion of field events to specifically shift the focus from the field as something that is situated in geographic and social spaces, which is what the term site connotes, whether these spaces are physical or virtual. So we suggest to look at the field as a collection of ethnographically significant events that are co-created within specific practices that involve ethnographers, their interlocutors, and digital technologies. So the aim here is to illustrate how the technologies shape the field, the ethnographic data, and also the relations between the ethnographers and our interlocutors. And there might be many ways in which the technologies do that. And today I focus on three. So the first is I look at the visual technologies and how they shape the field. I look at how they are locally situated. And I also look at the temporality. So let's just move to the image first, the webcam. The photo that you see on the left is an image from a so-called digital diary. So my colleague Fang came up with this method when she was studying eating habits of young Chinese migrants from Malaysia. And these young people traveled frequently between Malaysia, Singapore, and Taiwan for higher education and for temporary jobs. And Fang traveled with a few of them for a while, but she found it really impossible to do this in terms of time and money, and also, just plain bodily capacities, what is possible to do. So instead, she asked her study participants to use their smartphones to take photos of their eating habits daily and to share these photos with her through whatever social media platform they preferred. And there were quite a few positive sides to this. Fang Fang was able to track not only her interlocutors' food behavior, but also their geographic shifts between different countries and their daily movements between the various locations where they purchased and prepared and consumed their food. So the smartphone made it possible to capture the everyday moments related to eating, and it provided a really rich data set that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. And she was able to collect this data for 2 years. Now, in my own fieldwork, the nurses abroad, and this was true especially for men, for sons, found the webcam particularly useful to monitor their parents' health because of the particular affordance of the webcam to show images. So that's the photo that you see on the right side of the screen. They were aware of the possibility that their parents might not reveal their health issues to them over the phone. So these nurses often asked their good friends who lived close to their parents in Kerala to drop by every once in a while and bring along their smartphone or tablet, and then set up a webcam connection between the parents and their sons abroad. Yet the images produced through smartphones and webcams may not tell the whole story. They may expose certain things and hide others from the family members abroad, but also from ethnographers. So if you look at if we have a second look at the digital diary photo, we can think about questions like, were the items in the photo staged specifically for the photograph? Did the picture food really, end up in the interlocutor's belly, or did any of it end up in the trash bins? Was any of this food shared with others, and if so, what, how much, and with whom, and so on? Many other questions that we can think of. And here, what was really interesting is that Fang Fang was able to collect additional data through social media, and what was so through chatting, and this method sort of turned into a certain photo voice as well. And what I really appreciated about this method was that they used a lot of emoticons. So I think this is something that could and should be studied a bit further. So smartphones really made it possible to collect data across geographic locations and at all times of the day. But I think it still needs to be emphasized that there are particular kinds of data. So they are to a certain degree decontextualized still. If we move on to how technologies are locally situated. So the term absent presence comes from STS, and it describes that which is involved in the making of technology, but is not immediately visible. So what is largely visible to us are keyboards and screens that we use every day, but telecommunication infrastructures, as well as the socio-political environments in which they're embedded, are really key to supporting the functioning of digital technologies. And just like technologies, infrastructures are really not universal. They differ from one location to another, and they're subject to regional forces of nature and to the local communities at various scales. So in my fieldwork, field events were most significantly influenced by various national ICT legislation regulations. In Oman, for example, the use of Skype and some other internet-based calling services was not allowed at the time of my fieldwork. There were a number of platforms available, but the rules and regulations regarding their use changed quickly and unpredictably. So field events depend on how digital technologies are locally situated within their infrastructures, telecommunication infrastructures. And the final point that I want to mention, so in any sort of fieldwork, setting meetings with interlocutors can be challenging, but then including ICTs in the interactions adds other dimensions to this challenge, such as managing communications across time zones. And here asynchronous communication can be more convenient, but at the same time, it's also, I think, interesting to keep in mind that in synchronous communication, the fieldwork can actually be more embodied in the sense that your body feels more involved with whatever is happening on the other side of the device you're using. So it becomes more about being then than being there, to use Patty Gray's terms. More importantly, when fieldwork is done through ICTs, when and how does it end? For both Fang Fang and me, the exact moment our fieldwork started was really crystal clear. The date was really printed on our airline boarding passes, but the involvement of digital technologies made the ending of fieldwork much less clear-cut. So, for example, in Fang Fang's study, the participants continued to send her digital food diaries even after she no longer requested them, and she had to cut the field short and explicitly stop regular interaction with the young people by determining a point in time where she would no longer count the received photos as data. But even such cutting of the field didn't really imply a final exit. So she, and that was also the case for me, we both remained in contact with our fieldwork participants, even though much more sporadically, for several years on social media. And this has proven, at least for me, very useful for follow-up fieldwork. Writing about the impact of the internet on the practice of ethnography, Anne Beaulieu writes that leaving the field will either have to be reinvented or else ethnography will develop a more ongoing character. And our fieldwork illustrates that this is not an either-or situation. Living the field needs to be reinvented, and ethnography is also developing a more ongoing character. So I think that this is a really crucial time for ethnographers to reconsider what is good fieldwork. So digital technologies do allow ethnographers to study, to reach places that would otherwise not be accessible. And they do so in different ways, depending on which type of technologies do we use. But so when reaching interlocutors physically is not possible, ICTs are really invaluable. And this is especially, of course, became important during the pandemic times, as ethical committees, at least many of them, have started to explicitly require that no interviews are made face-to-face. So, it's become a standard, whereas more than a year ago, this was really a less desirable alternative. So I think that this is the time to seriously, individually and collectively reconsider what the norms of good fieldwork are when ICTs become involved in our fieldwork. And the notion of field events mandates a reconsideration of both spatial and temporal boundaries of fieldwork. I will leave it there. I have many questions for you in terms of, what is good fieldwork still?
Yeah,
so
thanks very much. Yeah. Thanks very much, Tanya. That's kind of good timing. Was just wondering whether to intervene or not. Yeah, so now this is our second paper, is by Charles Martin Shields from the German Development Institute, and it's Digitalization and New Knowledge Geographies, How the Pandemic Affects Migration Policy Research. So over to you, Charles.
Good morning. Let's get this going. Is everyone seeing my slideshow?
Yes, yes.
Ah, super. Okay. Yeah, so I've actually enjoyed listening in. I'm also joining rather early in the morning. So I understand Tanya's position as well. And the motivation for this paper when Irvin reached out to me was a real opportunity to think about how digitalization is not only a process that I do research on as a development aid researcher, but over the last year, how digitalization, for those of us working in think tanks that have their research agendas set by policymakers, how digitalization affects the relationships between myself as a think tank researcher, the policymakers I work with, and my research partners, and what this means when the technology of the airplane no longer becomes a viable technology to use. So just to give some background of my thinking, this is a super new idea for me. It's very conceptual, so I am not as far along as I think others on the panel will be. And I am very happy to receive ideas, especially around conceptual frameworks, because knowledge geography it's a new space for me, and this is a great chance to dive into it a bit. The context I'm coming from, and this is a little bit, I would say, autoethnographic, is science-grounded policy advice and what's happened with COVID. So I'm also getting to explore this perspective as someone who works in a think tank that does policy advice. So there's a reflexive aspect to this. And how has the pandemic affected policy-driven research on migration and mobility? The policy-driven component is important, as I was thinking about this, because it changes the speed with which the funder is expecting maybe not published results, but results that they can then turn around and turn back into policy recommendations for parliamentarians or operational recommendations for themselves and how they engage with partner countries. And without airplanes, I want to look at how digitalization has filled these gaps, but also how it's reconfigured the relationship between policymakers as funders, think tanks as kind of the conduit between the funders and the countries that the funders want to work in, and partners in the global south. And I'll talk about kind of how these constellations are set up in the case of my institute. And then something that kind of struck me is then thinking in a space where the research is meant to affect political decision making, how do the technologies have politics? How do they shape the relationships between these three actors in this constellation when things have to be mediated digitally? So to kind of give some background on the space I work in, pre-2020, if I was doing policy advice research and was funded to do maybe 3 years of research on forced displacement in East Africa, the funder, in my ministry's case, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, would come to my think tank and say, this is a policy space that we're really focused on. Here is 3 years of funding. And we're quite lucky where I work to have a fair amount of latitude and scientific independence in terms of how we answer the questions we're being asked. So we get the resources to do this work based on policy initiatives. And then we go and we say, we are here in the global north, we're not in East Africa. And if one is to look at the University of Pennsylvania's breakdown of global think tanks and how they rank them, many are in the global north. And I don't mean that to say that there aren't really excellent think tanks in the global south, but I would say the community of think tank research is very centered in Europe and the United States. And I think this plays a role in how we think about reconfiguring these constellations when we're using digital tools to manage research. So my think tank in Bonn, Germany, has ongoing partnerships in a lot of countries with universities, with local think tanks, and we would coordinate with them to come up with a research strategy and make sure that while we're working on the ground my work has often been in Kenya or Malaysia or Colombia, our local partners are highly involved in the development of research instruments. And then at the end of the day, we collect all our data, and I would fly back to Germany and continue doing the kind of the scientific article writing, policy or data analysis with my partners in whatever country I was in. But the expectation from the funder, from the ministry, is that I'll quickly turn around some initial results. And at the end of the day, I end up being the face that they see for a presentation about what we were doing, what that means for shaping policy or shaping projects or programs that the ministry is running. So all of this is very airplane dependent. And as the researcher at the think tank, I kind of play the intermediary role of taking the knowledge out of whatever country I was in and quickly turning it into something for the ministry that funds me. What happened last year? Well, flying no longer became an option. That technology had to be put aside. I'm sure it will become an option again. And for a lot of think tanks, including mine, this was a kind of a shock to the system in terms of how we coordinate policy advice with the ministry we work with, because we couldn't physically see them anymore, and how we coordinate our ongoing research with our partners in East Africa, for example. And this is where the digitally mediated stuff comes in, where we started switching from the airplane to Zoom and email, and if we were doing survey research, using cloud tools so that we could also just see dashboards of survey data as it came in. But what does this mean for how I now relate to partners, how I relate to my funder, and how the funder relates to my partners in a new way? What I kind of have observed and what I want to unpack more is that my partners, who are all in the global south, now play this very central role. Even though I can communicate with them on Zoom, they play this very central role in shaping the research in a way that probably pre-2020, they would not have before. I would have been physically there. We would have been around a desk, creating research instruments, shaping questions. You know, my input as a person from the global north would have been much more central to this process. And without me there, you know, the way that data collection and knowledge generation and shape puts my partners much more in control. And I think this is a very interesting space that digitalization has created for them, and also has created in terms of how, yeah, we relate across context and across geographic space. But because this stuff is meant, the research is meant to inform policy, how does this digital turn in terms of collecting information and turning it into knowledge affect trust when the interlocutors are quite different, or the relationships between interlocutors have changed? And trust being, if I'm a policymaker who's going to see this information and suddenly the person that I normally expect to see coming back from a country, in that case maybe me, is no longer coming back from a country and no longer had as strong a hand in shaping the way data was collected and the way questions were asked. What does that mean for me as a policymaker when I see information presented to me, and how does it affect my trust or my treatment of the information that is now collected through completely digitally mediated processes? So methodologically, this is what I'd like to do probably in the fall. As I said, this is a bit of looking in the mirror for me at a think tank that pre-COVID, the technology of data collection was the airplane and actually going to the country I was working in. And now post-COVID, there is much more of a concept around how we manage networks of research at our think tank at DIE digitally. I get the opportunity, being in a kind of unique position, to talk with colleagues both at DIE and other think tanks at Bonn who are going through this. And how has digitalization changed their relationship, not only with their partners, the people they do research with, but funders as well, and especially policy-oriented funders, where there is a step beyond the science that goes on once we've kind of created some kind of knowledge base. I also want to take the ability I have to access policymakers, and I'm in a unique position with the ministry that funds us to be able to go and ask them. I have the kind of, I would say, personal relationships that allow me to ask more probing questions about things like trust, and how does the expectation that I would travel and can no longer travel kind of affect the way that policymakers view the data that comes out of a global South context. And what does it mean to a policymaker if they know that this research is highly shaped or completely shaped in the data collection and analysis process by, my partners in Kenya or my partners in Malaysia, where I'm only able to mediate when time zones allow, or when I see data come onto a dashboard? How does this affect the relationship between me, the funder, and my partners, and the trust or treatment of knowledge that is collected digitally? And then last but not least, actually getting to interview my partners in the Global South, and how do they perceive a shift in power and the ability to shape knowledge creation in different ways than previously? So when we talk about displacement and migration, some work we'll be doing is in Colombia. I could imagine that this creates a space for my Colombian partners to really shape the way that knowledge is being created and transmitted back to a ministry that does a lot of work in their country. They now have the chance to say to directly to them, here's what you need to know. And it puts them in a very different position to shape how this knowledge is both transmitted and what it means when it's turned into policy that affects their country. On the flip side, I've heard from these same colleagues that digitalization has lowered the costs of engagement quite a bit. And they're at times exhausted by the volume of requests that come from researchers in my position in the Global North saying, let's work together. We have resources, you're in the place. So let's work on this. And I think a lot of people in particular today have said there's also an exhausting pace that's come because I no longer have to bear the cost of getting on an airplane. So the speed with which requests come in is quite different. I'd really like to assess how that affects their role in knowledge development as it relates to policy advice as well. So as I said, this is brand new. This is a very new idea for me, and I'm quite happy to get feedback. It's not my core area of expertise. I'm a political scientist by training. So I don't have results yet, but what I'm hoping to come away with is a better understanding of how the power dynamics between funder, think tank, and global south partners change when everything is digitally mediated. You know, how do funders and policymakers trust this information, and what are the biases I think have to be examined? And then I think as a really core thing, identify how to make new digital constellations of research something that are standard, and also to center the voices of the people I work with. My Colombian colleagues, for example, know far more about the context they're working in than I do. And how do I use my role as a quasi-trusted interlocutor working in a digital space to make my funder understand this is the knowledge that you really want, and it's coming to you, and you can make really great use of it. And how do I facilitate that in a digital space? That is what I also like to come away with. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I look forward to feedback.
Yeah, thanks very much, Charles. And so our last speaker for this session is Irvin Cabal Quinto. His title of his presentation is Immobilities in the Field, Deconstructing Researcher Participant Dynamics in a Remote Interview Setting. So over to you, Irvin.
Okay, I'll try to make the presentation on time, and I won't go overboard. So thank you for today's for the opportunity to actually talk about my methods in doing digital media research and understanding really the digital media practices of elderly people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds here in Melbourne, Australia, particularly looking at their digital media practices during the pandemic. So just to give you an overview, today's focus is just really unpacking how I conducted the remote interviews, just really looking at, I was situated in my apartment and all of my participants were in their own residential places. So I conducted 15 interviews with elderly CALD people, and I'm particularly looking at examining digital communication technologies used in sustaining relationships during the 2020 lockdown here in Melbourne, Australia, but also looking at the broader picture of this digital media literacy practices, wherein it's very important to really have those literacies to enact relationships or for even like a broader picture of civic participation. But stepping back, I'm also reflecting on this idea of existential immobility by Hagen. So he's looking at this idea of the state of stuckness during a crisis. You feel like you're not progressing, you are in a particular space and you're not connecting to other people. But I'm challenging that in my own research, wherein we have all of these digital technologies allowing the connections that we need to sustain relationships. And in really thinking about the process of, or the methods that I deployed for my research, which is remote interviewing, I look at data collection, reflecting on my analysis of the findings and the ethical considerations while doing all of this remote interviewing, which is very important. And then I also approach remote interviewing through that philosophical kind of like perspective, wherein it's an assemblage of the human, the digital, and home, building on the work by Lupton Watson and others like scholars, and really unpacking with those immobility in a particular space connected by virtual mobilities, what are the material and affective dimensions enacted in such spaces. So just a background about my research, I did my recruitment of the participants through snowball sampling. So I was connected to different migrant organizations. I called them through phone calls. I distributed the call for participants via email. And I also advertised via Twitter and through my own academic website. So it's interesting. So I started contacting these migrant communities, organizations. I spoke to the leaders. So the leaders actually spoke to the members and started talking about my research, but the leader actually asked me to contact the participants to explain the project. Instead, he just mentioned, but then I was the one explaining and calling them at a particular time. So I conducted the interviews during the lockdown from August, October last year. And it's interesting with the consent form. So I'll be discussing later, that my method is actually turned into a data, which I'm surprised. Because I mean, like for example, the consent forms, they have to sign it. I was expecting to do it face to face, but then because of the lockdown, all of the consent forms, some of them were sent via email. For those who are actually requesting it via email, and they're able to print it, scan, sign it, and then scan and return to me. Some actually had their family members taking a photo of what they received on email, and they printed it by email with assistance. But also the last option that I had was audio recording. So here's the interesting part with audio recording. I explained to the participant the research, but I didn't do the consent or the recording of the consent at that time. So I explained the project, I let them decide if they want to participate. And then from another session, that's where the audio recording for the consent actually happened, and then segue to the interviews. So all of my interviews were conducted remotely through phone calls and via Zoom. I had, which I'll show you later, the chart, the number of people that I interviewed via phone call and Zoom. I also used field notes to actually talk about or note my observations during, before and after the remote interviewing. And today I'll be using a Lego to visualize the data that I collected, to just tease out all of these connections and disconnections at the time of a lockdown, and how we're actually navigating a lockdown, particularly looking at the case of vulnerable communities, for example, the elderly people. So I'm approaching the remote interviewing as a kind of like this social material theoretical perspective, looking at the agency of individuals as shaped by the human digital home assemblage. And this is very particular with the remote interviewing I conducted, where I have those participants in their homes using technologies, but more than that, they have all of these platforms, they have all of these devices, and they had the networks to support them in enabling those sessions, which I'll be talking about shortly. And it's fascinating. It's building on to this work by Tanya, which she presented a while ago. You know, it's kind of like a field event. You have the effect, you have the material, and then the immaterial aspect of conducting interviews in that space. And it's creating this assemblage wherein we start thinking about, okay, so there's this spatial immobility now traversed via virtual mobilities. But this spatial immobility entangled with virtual mobilities can actually become a site of inequalities, can actually be a site of really interrogating digital media literacy at a time wherein we're actually forced to stay, in our places and observe social distancing measures and connect via digital communication technologies. So about the participants, so I interviewed 15 elderly people aged from 60 to 92 years old, and 9 females and 6 males. 7 were retired and 8 were working as full-time workers. 6 lived with their family members, 4 live with their partners, 4 live alone, and 1 live with non-family members, such as international students renting out. So this is the chart that I'm showing to kind of like show you the number of Zoom interviews that I conducted. So I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Zoom interviews, and 4 of them video on. So the participant wanted the video to be on, but during the interviews, my video was on all the time. And then some opted not to have the video. And then majority had the mobile phones, and some, actually 1 had the telephone landline, because it can be set to a speakerphone and the person can actually sit down and listen and talk. It's as if I'm actually talking or she's talking to me in that space. What's fascinating about the method of remote interviewing, that's becoming a data. So for me, I was just like, okay, I was using it to collect the data during the study, but then it became like it's a data. In my observations, I was able to map out the different platforms and digital technologies that they use. But more fascinatingly, I actually unpack the uneven digital literacy levels in just choosing a particular platform to engage in an interview. And then I also started reflecting on this, what I call carrying digital media literacy, where in digital media literacy, the basic understanding of accessing information, consuming information across different platforms or channels, but also in the context of the domestication of technology, there's a sense of care, pushing people to be receiving those care in an interview setting, and also facilitated by the social networks, which I was surprised during the fieldwork, because I started talking to my participants and I realized that their setup of the Zoom was actually assisted or supported by their children, their grandchildren, even, to kind of like set up those arrangements. And it's fascinating because it's not only about those material aspects shaping the interviews in that space, but also the affective dimensions wherein the kind of like being still in a place can actually create that sense of connection, can actually compel you to move in a particular way, which I'll be talking about shortly, but also let you realize that they're really kind of like immobility shaped by digital literacies. Okay, so let's start some of the data that I actually have. So starting the interview was quite fascinating because it was a remote interview. And this is the case for Dina. So she's actually 92 years old. And then I phoned her several times to discuss the project. But then at the time when we were to do the interview with the audio consent, she actually told me that she doesn't remember me. So in that moment, I really had to really think about, I'm actually dealing with a particular cohort of participants that I need to adjust my approach in understanding their capacity to engage in remote interviewing. For her, I understand it, she was telling me that, oh, sorry, I'm actually forgetful already. I kind of like forget that we already spoke before, and now is the interview session. And also in establishing a report, the materiality of the screen actually prompted all of those loosening of conversations and engaging the participants. And this is the case for Mohammed, which is based on my field notes in September 3 last year. And he was particularly pointing at the scarf that I was wearing at that time. And he was saying that it's kind of like looking good. It looks like an Arabic. So he's Syrian. So he's kind of like connecting to that kind of like object. And from that conversation, it kind of like loosened. And for me as well as the person interviewing the participant, I felt that I was actually talking to my grandfather in that sense. But of course, this is the kind of like generating that report, that connectivity triggered by the screen of the device, but also the object in the actual interviewing process. What's fascinating as well during the interview with remote interviewing, the revelation of the digital media literacy. When we think about digital media literacy, this is the kind of like use of technologies, processing of information, being self-aware, those stuff. But there's a lot of emerging theories now looking at the socio-cultural aspect of digital media literacy. And I'm looking at this from that perspective of situating digital media literacy in the home. And what I actually uncovered during the interview is a domestication. Those relationships, familial relationships in the home were actually quite pivotal in shaping the kind of like setup for the interview. For example, when I interviewed Rosa, I was surprised because the granddaughter was actually there. And the granddaughter told me that to call this number, and I was surprised because so she was asking me to call that. So I called the number, then she picked up the phone, and I said to her, this is actually interview for your grandmother, but I don't have the consent for you to participate in the actual interview. And she said, I'm actually happy to assist my grandmother because that feeling of I love her, I care for her. And she's able to set up the phone for the grandmother, but also was able to translate some of the English text, obviously a lot of the English text that I was showing, and kind of like translating them into Macedonian. So she was translating, she became an interpreter, and then she was giving me all of the English responses by her mother. But at the same time, the grandmother was also butting in and expressing things in English that she feels like she's able to understand based on her understanding. And apart from that one, I think it's also important to really think about the ethics of care when engaging with elderly people, particularly in a very turbulent time like the pandemic. At that time, I was like really very aware of how I was delivering, how I was speaking slowly, I was articulating my words, and I was also really paying attention to the idea that I'm a migrant, I might be able to say the words in a different accent that my respondents won't be able to understand. So I was very careful in really saying those words, but also listening carefully to what they're saying. And in that sense, there were moments in the interviews wherein one participant actually read a poem to me about his experiences in Australia, and he named this poem as "The Lovely Australia." So I was sitting there listening to the poem, to the way he delivered, and I thought I was actually transported to this performative aspect of the capacity of the participants to evoke or to perform their capacities or their knowledges in that particular space of what they like to do. Because, for example, in the case of Muhammad, he likes really writing poems in English and Arabic. So that kind of stillness was actually transformed into also communicative and imaginative, not only by the digital technology, but the kinds of like words, text being shared in that digital space. And what's fascinating, looking at this idea of the caring digital media literacy. So a lot of my participants were really talking about, and this is an important intervention when we start thinking about digital media literacy and how it's being domesticated, how it's being shaped by family relationships. And in this case, it's the caring, factor, the caring obligations in the family that would be shaping those kinds of like engagements. And for example, Mali was saying, actually, for us old people, you learn from your family when you start cooking, right? But then she's also saying that for us old people, we kind of like, we don't look for Google or YouTube to get information to learn something. But for old people, we ask our children or grandchildren. So this is an important part for that family dynamics kind of like being incorporated in those narratives and just really unpacking those ideas. And even in my situation last year, because I was caring for my father, who was actually had an operation, the good operation, I had this idea of like the transnational telecocooning wherein I was caring for my family members. But then at that time, it was also an idea that what I learned from the field can actually be translated to caring for my family. I was sharing YouTube videos, which were mentioned by my participants as a form of care to my father. And I think it's important to highlight, maybe I'll just discuss that immobile moments later for the question and answer, to just really think about the moments in the interviewing process wherein that social material theoretical perspective could be coming in, the entanglements of spatial mobility and virtual mobility, rather, and also the limitations, because I recruited the participants through phone calls, through online. So it might be a different story if I'm able to go to community organizations and found out that, kind of like people do not have access to technologies and I can interview them as well, or that the digital media literacy level. And lastly, the support networks that will be shaping those communications. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Irvin. That was wonderful. So I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I just wanted to check with you, Irvin, because we started a bit late this session. We're supposed to end at 4:30, but it's already 4:22. So can we go a bit over because we started 10 minutes late? So could we we'll have to go a bit into the break? Does that suit?
Maybe
Irvin?
we can cancel the break. We can just proceed with the question and answer and segue to the third panel.
Okay,
We can
let's
cut down
go.
the
Maybe
break
we can just
to
have a very short break.
5 minutes, 5-minute break, 5-minute break.
Okay. So thanks a lot. I thought these papers were very interesting, and for me, they brought together this whole idea of the event in the first paper, and how we theoretically understand the event, but looking at events like eating. And then the second one was about this idea of constellation, but how the constellation includes partners in the funding agencies and partners in the global south and think tanks. And the other thing that I really liked was the whole idea of assemblage, which you brought into Irvin. So those three sort of they're theoretical concepts for me. So anyway, that's just a comment, and if anybody want to respond to that. But yes, so any questions?
From wherever you are, it's my pleasure to chair this final session. My name is Koen Leurs. I'm based at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and this is Immobile Entanglements, Cultures of Immobile Entanglements, our final panel, which will be consisting of 3 presentations, which we'll have in the order as listed on the program, after which we'll have the Q&A collectively. So first, I would like to invite our first speaker, which will be Adres Umel from Bremen International Graduate School of Social Science to start her presentation. Presenters will have roughly 12 minutes for their presentation, and we'll save questions to the end. Adres, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Koen, and good day to everyone. Thank you for having me here. Let me just prepare my presentation. Share my screen.
Sure.
Is my first slide already there?
Yes, it's there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, thank you again for sticking up until now. I'm at the last leg of my dissertation for a PhD in psychology. So I'm here today to present my last empirical paper for my doctoral project and to kind of give a more social psychological lens to what we've been hearing throughout this workshop. And I'd like to talk first about my empirical study and findings. Then at the end, time permitting, I would like to share some of my reflections about finishing the study as even though I did the fieldwork during pre-COVID times, my writing of the manuscript analyses occurred at the height of the pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to let you know more of the framework that I'm coming from. So my work follows recent research highlighting how social media, particularly Facebook, have enabled migrants to jointly transcend not just geographic distance, but also the synchronous aspect of time, not just for the purposes of integration and sustaining homeland connections, but also for constructing meaningful shared experiences regardless of people's varied locations. So I specifically adapt Esther Perrin's spatio-temporal perspective on diaspora, which she developed based on the Bakhtinian concept of the chronotope, or the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships. So for Perrin, migrants usually locate themselves at the center of multiple configurations of space and time. Specifically, migrants unavoidably navigate between their homeland chronotopes, or their jointly constructed meanings of their past, there and then life and rhythms in the home country, and their host chronotopes, or their shared ideas of their present, here and now realities in their host society. Perrin, however, does not discount the presence of other chronotopes in the migration experience, yet did not elaborate on this, and thus introduced the notion of irony as chronotope to describe intersecting yet contradictory space-time configurations based on the situational form of irony, which reflects the positioning of selves in a salient situation of certain incoherence, especially between what are expected and what happens. So I explore this nexus of social media, time-space configurations, and migration through a digital ethnographic study with a Facebook group of Filipino migrants in Germany. So my study design is as follows. So I used Facebook as a research base, and my case study group is a group of Filipino migrants permanently or temporarily living in Germany that are part of a certain Facebook group. At the time of study, there were more than 4,000 members, and I used participant observation. So I was lucky at that time, of course, there was no pandemic yet, and focused face-to-face focus group discussions in 6 different German cities, and selective archiving of Facebook group threads for data gathering for 3 months. So a weekly data gathering for 3 months. And then my analytic approaches include online ethnographic analysis and discursive psychology. So here's my first set of analysis or findings. So first, I looked into how Filipino migrants in Germany construct their spatio-temporal ideas of their home and host lands. The Filipino migrants' chronotype of their homeland, the Philippines, is on the one hand, that of a tropical island, or time space of seemingly eternal sunshine or summertime, and a possible everyday enjoyment of the beach, various fresh fruits and seafood. The Philippines is also a time space of warmth, familiarity, and fun because of being always surrounded by loved ones or familiar communal interactions. On the other hand, the home chronotope is also characterized as a time space of cultural entrapment because of certain practices that tie the migrants to familial duties and communal expectations. Now, the Filipino migrants' chronotype of Germany, on the other hand, as host country, is characterized by their novel and palpable experience of snow in the winter season, for having to wear several layers and thick clothes and to encounter snow. So for many female Filipinos in particular, finally reaching Germany marks the culmination of their long-awaited reunion with the German partners or spouses. However, as Germany, as a time space of wintry wonder, eventually becomes a time space of struggle and isolation as migrants are left alone in the household or to figure things out on their own. As migrants stay longer, however, Germany also becomes a time space of transformation as they learn new skills and knowledge in a time space of newfound rootedness, especially through bearing children who inspire them further to overcome challenges. And they learn to do things on their own and have a can-do attitude. So apart from this, what else did I ask? I asked, how do they negotiate these diasporic chronotopes in the Facebook group platform that they are part of? So the tropical island elements that characterize the Filipino migrants' homeland chronotope cannot be imported to Germany. But the warmth, comfort, and fun brought about by co-ethnic bonds can be. So being able to remember these communal aspects of the home chronotype in turn enables the migrants to better navigate the Germany host chronotype elements of struggle and isolation. And our Filipino colleagues here will be able definitely to also recognize these home chronotypes. So as such, the participants appropriated the Facebook group platform as a reenactment of the Philippine homeland. And as a modern treffpunkt or meeting place of Filipinos in Germany through a remembering of homeland community relations, practices, and traditional village leadership. So the Facebook group administrators nurtured such barangay time space through establishing a closed Facebook group, strictly filtering membership, and making full use of the pin post feature for community or village hall announcements. The admins and members also made full use of the pin post and group wall to nurture a digital, symbolic, and social psychological version of the Filipino practice of bayanihan, or community support and solidarity, as you can see in the picture here. Bayanihan originates from an actual Filipino context of spatial-temporal movement. Village members literally carrying a relocating member's physical home from one place to another. Such community practice is transposed into the Facebook group through not only their sharing of tips, information, and experiences, but also through a nurturing time space where members can interact in familiar Filipino ways, such as enabling group members to speak in Filipino or various Philippine languages, or to practice Filipino Catholic rituals and ways as simple as sharing prayers or wishing someone divine guidance, God bless you, such as these. So lastly, the Facebook group serves reminiscent of the Filipino plaza, or public time space for communal celebrations and rituals of comfort and relaxation outside the home. So the group wall in particular becomes a source for everyday entertainment, open exchanges of jokes, anecdotes, or amusing internet content. For other members, the mere chance to observe co-ethnic interrelations or interactions, including misunderstandings or disputes, becomes a comic relief. So amidst the Filipino migrant community's reenactment of the Filipino homeland, so these are the things that we can see are intersecting, multiple chronotypic intersections. And here I quoted one example or one post. Not all Filipinos who are abroad have a good life. So to those who are left in the Philippines, learn to be thankful and to be content of what is given to you. So this quote is reminiscent or gives an idea on how some of the posts also in the plaza are used as a way to resist or contest certain homeland chronotypes in the view of co-ethnics from home, how they view the migrants there abroad as being, just sources perhaps of money, of financial and material support. And the Facebook group becomes, in this sense, their space of being able to contradict these constructions. Lastly, apart from this, I observed and analyzed specific time-space configurations within the community's Facebook interactions that emerged strikingly ironic, and what possible action orientations such interconnected yet contradictory chronotypes imply. So this is an example. So before I give you the analysis, I'd like to show a sample post, or a thread of sample post, where I have gathered and tried to conceptualize this irony as chronotype. So specifically, I noticed such recurring discussion threads about members' experiences of meeting or socializing with co-ethnics offline. So an example of which is this excerpt. I shall read it by Mandy. She says, have you also experienced your fellow Kappa Filipino here, one you just met, asking you what's the status of your stay or visa here? What's your job? How much you earn? How long you've been here? How you managed to get to Germany as a single? With a bit of sarcasm. Just because they have been here for a long time and already big time. It's just very sad to think of. When we are not competing, we're all on the same, venturing and taking our chances to help our loved ones in the Philippines. Please do not belittle your fellow humans, especially if fellow Filipinos. And then there were also supporting images and text, but we shall skip that for now. So someone who replied to that to the post said, Bernadette said, I'm only on my way to Germany next week, but that's severe. So pertaining to what the situation that was mentioned earlier. Sometimes it's our fellow men who belittle us when we should be helping each other out because we came from the same country. But of course, there will always be people who are arrogant. It's just really saddening that you think when you talk to your fellow man, your homesickness will go away since you both get to talk in Filipino, but it's actually more stressful. And Sarah also said, with overseas Filipino workers, dear, it is worse. At least in Germany, you don't feel who is rich, who is poor. That's why for us, in the Philippines, there are levels in sense because still carrying Spanish attitudes, disdainful when they look at you, it's from head to toe. So how did I analyze this? So very briefly, so such coincidental surprise moments or organized communal events were expected to be time spaces of comfort and familiarity, and for the strengthening of co-ethnic bonds. Again, supposedly reflective of Philippine homeland warmth and friendly communal relations. Yet many such encounters unfortunately end up as disappointments, as migrants are snubbed by fellow men, are treated as material for gossip, or gatherings sometimes turn out as time spaces for flamboyance or social judgment. In turn, these ironic chronotopes of disconcerting offline co-ethnic meetings, whether circumstantial or elaborately organized, unfortunately lead to a secondary level of irony within Facebook threads, Filipinos discouraging fellow Filipinos from engaging with and trusting co-ethnics. So conflicting chronotopes of co-ethnic distancing and distrust amidst a Filipino Facebook group formed in the spirit of Filipino community and solidarity can be better understood in the context of the term kapwa, or the core value of Filipino identity and psychology, which means shared identity or oneness of self and other. So Filipino as kapwa, a relational self, goes hand in hand with moral social obligations, especially treating one's fellow men with respect and dignity. So in facilitating Filipino migrants in Germany to enact their homeland, the Facebook group platform further enabled the capture of such irony chronotopes that illustrate another layer of complexity in migrants' lived experiences of diaspora. So as a conclusion, identifying such irony chronotopes invites a more dialogical, dynamic view of how diasporic relations prosper, fail, and in what directions diasporic identities evolve. It also involves or also invites researchers to further tap into ethnocultural meanings of ironic situations and self-other relations. As such, cultural aspects contribute to what can be defined as ironic. And lastly, as my own self-reflection as the one conducting this analysis, I did this in the midst also of many personal experiences, like my family experienced the COVID viral infection 3 times, so twice directly and once an extended household. So but at the same time, the experiences of the migrants enabled me to really reflect on how to give myself a sense of mobility despite these distressful situations that have immobilized me as a researcher. So it's like the sensing researcher introduced by Saskia that we also embody. I was able to also look into my own research and embody and apply the insights that my participants and their narratives have shared to me. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much, Adres, for your elaboration of the chronotope as an analytic lens, and also adding there towards the end your own analytic reflections of conducting this research as part of during the pandemic. If you would mind closing your shared screen, I think we can invite our second speaker.
Is it closed?
At the top of this screen, usually you have to, yes. Do you see it? Yes. Great, and then it's a great pleasure to introduce. So let's save our questions for others towards the end of during the collective Q&A. And let's now invite our second speaker in this panel, who is Margaret Cheeseman, affiliated with the Oxford Internet Institute, and she'll present her paper titled Faith and Digital Infrastructure, Cultural Responses to Blockchain in Aid. So Margie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm on a backup laptop and I'm just having some issues with my system preferences. So I don't know, I was just going to ask, maybe you could ask some questions now while I figure it out, because I've just tried to send you the presentation and it's too large. I'm having file problems, so I might need 2 minutes. I'm really sorry.
No problem. I see your PowerPoint also coming in. Does anyone have a
Coin. Maybe we can
yeah.
go first with Luca if he's ready, and then we can. So while the file is sending, if it's
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can. Hold on a sec.
Then after I can show your presentation, Margie.
Yes.
Luca, thanks for stepping in. So we have Luca Volles, affiliated with Lancaster University, speaking about COVID, mobile patients and healthcare inequalities, some notes on returning to the field.
Let me just, oops. I'm looking for, sorry, this is different from my usual laptop. Here we go. Okay, yeah, you can see my PowerPoint, yeah?
Yep.
Cool.
If you can set it to full screen, then.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yes, it's on full screen, thanks.
Okay, great. So first of all, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting us to present our work today. And as you can see, the title of the presentation is COVID, Mobile Patients and Healthcare Inequalities, Some Notes on Returning to the Field. What I'd like to do today is sort of reflect on some of the obstacles and perhaps opportunities that the ongoing pandemic has produced for research based on the activities of our ongoing project, Doctors Within Borders networking initiative on mobile populations and contemporary health systems. So besides myself and my co-author Carolina Follis, this group includes Janine Morley from also Lancaster University and Nicola Burns from Glasgow University. It's funded from a grant from the Wellcome Trust, and it sort of is supposed to establish a research network to bring together experts in health and migration, NGOs, the NHS, and health professionals across Europe that deliver care to mobile and migrant groups. And basically the idea is to explore the dynamic and sometimes unexpected ways that health professionals engage with the mobility of their patients outside of the regular health system. So I think to kind of find one example of how our experience informs the themes of this workshop, I think we can, I could draw on a 2-day workshop that we held last month, actually just about 30 days ago, which was originally meant to be hosted in London, but because of COVID had to be postponed and then ultimately had to be delivered virtually. And I think in this context, you know, the use of network technology was incredibly positive in the sense that through digital technology, our event had a wider geographical reach and participation, but I think more importantly, it had the effect of facilitating deeper and thicker conversations. So we were able to bring in local perspectives in the field, different sites into conversation in a way that we had tried to do previously in a pre-pandemic workshop, but which because of the vagaries of you know, bureaucracy and visas and what have you, we weren't able to. So I can just give 2 examples of this very briefly. One was that we were able to have the keynote by one of our project partners, who's a medical director of an infectious disease clinic in Palermo, in a central Palermo hospital, and who has like something like 20 years of experience, you know, treating and screening and delivering medical care to migrants. I mean, during pandemic, he rolled out a vaccination program for migrants. And basically, we had tried to get him to come to England before, and it was difficult because obviously he's busy and he only speaks Italian. And so we were able to, pre-record the lecture in Italian. We subtitled it in Glasgow. We sort of premiered it on the workshop night. And then we asked another network partner in London to be able to, who's also a medical doctor, she's an academic, she's a respiratory specialist, to act as respondent. And they had this really fascinating intercultural exchange, which was mediated through simultaneous translation in Glasgow. And I think, what was great about it was that there was a sort of flattening effect produced by this virtual co-presence, right? The sort of power symmetries that we normally link between, researcher and participant, practitioner and academic, right, were sort of decentered, but also the sort of primacy that we have connected with, the English language, right? Like everything is always in English, and with context, right? Often people travel to certain locations rather than having their own sense of place brought into the conversation. I think we were able to transcend this, and it was really interesting because it was really bumpy, in the sense that it wasn't, tremendously smooth, right? There was a lot of pauses, right? Because the translator was going back and forth, and somehow the audience stuck with it and tried to engage in it. And at the end, afterwards, the keynote speaker was telling me that he really enjoyed the experience because it brought really home for him the experience of his own interactions with migrants who come to him and are sort of talking to him through cultural mediators, right, translators, and are trying to understand essentially a foreign system that has very little sort of makes little allowance for their ignorance, or the aspects of Italian healthcare that they do not understand, or bureaucracy even. And so to bring that in, and that sort of kind of conversation, I think, really added a dynamic that would have been absent had it not been for both COVID and for the fact that everybody's doing it at the same time. So that's one example. And I think the same thing happened the next day. We had a US colleague that was presenting with one of her collaborators in Morocco on the Moroccan experience of the pandemic. And he's a social worker. We had tried to get him again here to the UK before, but again, he couldn't get a visa. It was really fascinating in the sense that she gave her presentation, and then in the question and answer session, she brought him into the conversation, and he gave his firsthand account in French, as it was sort of simultaneously translated by this translator in another Moroccan city via his cell phone, and it really, I think, again brought to the fore the sort of the need, right, to bring these kind of local conversations and these situated conversations into the discussion. And of course, right, there was, the wider issue, right, of the kind of academic connections that are made around the world, just like in this workshop, that we were all experiencing too. So, we had individuals from Germany, from France, from Morocco, from England, right, Scotland, Italy, and quite a few more that all participated in the conversation. So I think, in terms of building a conversation like this workshop, I think the experience of sort of network technology under COVID to build a research agenda that might have mobile scope, I think is quite positive. And I hope that this potential certainly endures past the pandemic. I think on the question of the kind of research that we are interested in as a group, which is looking at how essentially mobile patients deal with stable or situated healthcare systems, I think the question is a little bit more challenging. So I can turn to that very briefly. I don't know, how am I doing for time, just to get a sense?
You have 4 minutes.
Okay, I'll be brief. So in terms of, the kind of research that we conduct within the Doctors Within Borders project, we're very much interested in sort of, as I said, following how, mobile patients deal with national healthcare systems, which are by definition not really interested in dealing with individuals that are not situated and settled. And so in that context, right, COVID has really sort of brought a dramatic halt, or at least a wall to research. What COVID has shown us, right, is that some things, right, some essential things, some people, some idea must move, right, to save lives. But the majority of other things, peoples and ideas must not move to preserve public health. And so it has really underscored this fundamental paradox, right? That on the one hand, we have national health systems that are predicated on the mobility of capital, of objects, of data, and of humans, right? But of course, right, these national health systems themselves are essentially constructed and function to address the needs of their settled populations. And so, individuals that are outside of this sphere, right, fall out of the general overview and the general, let's say, interest of these institutions. And of course, the pandemic only made migrants more visible in this sense, right, because they could be reconstructed as a public health problem. So in a sense, it's brought this paradox dramatically to the fore. But sorry, I think I skipped a slide somewhere. Yeah, but it has also underscored the fact that mobility as a resource, as a capability, is not universally distributed, and many of its inequalities are rooted in gender, in race, and in disability inequalities. And those existing inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID-19, and in a way have revealed this complex and this really dense infrastructural backstage, right, that creates many of these inequalities and furthers them. So I think, it has grounded and sort of created a space to talk about issues of mobility justice following Mimi Scheller's work. It has created an opportunity to challenge pre-pandemic practices, right? Questions about care, questions about safety, housing, right? Healthcare, the role of cities, right? But at the same time, even as it underscores the importance of, looking through the lens of crisis to understand how, mobile worlds effectively create cascades of inequality and structural dysfunction. It also, right, needs to be mapped, right? This is something that, we understand relatively poorly, in part because of the multi-scalar extent of the problem, right? So, as you operate at the level of, let's say, supply chains, right, then you start to understand, if you're chasing respirators, you're not looking at PPE. You look at PPE and all of a sudden you don't have reagents. You're chasing reagents, and then all of a sudden you don't have enough tests, right? So that's at a kind of macro level, right? At the level also of borders. But then when you start to move, at more intermediary levels, right? Those effects cascade and create, sort of latent effects that, to a certain extent, are poorly diagnosed and also poorly understood in terms of their interrelationship. And so there is this real question about how do we map this? How do we get a sense of this kind of broader assemblage? And obviously we need mobile methods to do so. Yeah, I'm wrapping up. Obviously we need mobile methods to do so, right? To sort of map this system that is highly contingent, right? Even if you can call it a system, and which migrant patients move through, right, in a completely haphazard yet structured way. But to do so, we need to return to the field, right? We need to be able to bring the local experience of respondents into the research, and we need to be able to follow many of these mobile patients as they move through this sometimes arbitrary and highly unequal system. So mobile methods might be useful in the sense of providing digital technology that respondents can take through these exchanges. But really, there is no substitute, I think, for sort of researching this kind of work at a distance. So I guess I can leave it at that and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thanks also for your flexibility in jumping in when we had some tech issues with Margie's presentation. If you could stop sharing your screen, I think we can show.
I can try and share mine now, by the way. I might have figured it out.
Yeah, you can give it a try. Otherwise, I have it as a backup here.
Let's give it a go. Is this working?
Yes, if you can have it on full screen, then yes, it's perfect.
Great. Brilliant. So shall I just begin?
Yes, if you like. Thanks.
So I'm Margie. I'm a final year PhD student based at the Oxford Internet Institute. And it's really exciting to be here. Thanks very much for having me. I'm afraid I'm in the UK, so I've missed quite a lot of the proceedings, but I'm excited to hear more and read more. So like many of you here, I'm interested in the intersections between migration, the digital and ethnography. And I have a background in anthropology, but in particular, my PhD is looking at the infrastructures of finance and identification in contexts of forced migration. So my talk today is about a PhD chapter that I'm currently writing up, so a bit of a work in progress. And it's focused on my research with Syrian women in Jordan's refugee camps, and it's looking at their experiences with a blockchain-based financial aid system. So based on women's perspectives, I'm going to argue that faith offers a really important analytic frame for understanding digitally mediated forced migration and for kind of dismantling some of the assumptions around blockchain in particular as a hyped up technology in the humanitarian sector. So if you may have heard a little bit about blockchain, one of the most famous kind of features that is most discussed about blockchain is trust. So blockchain is a database technology. It's best known as the kind of database system underpinning Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And since about 2016, major proponents in the technology sector, engineers, advocates within aid organizations have suggested that blockchain is going to revolutionize the humanitarian and migration management sector. So a key claim made about blockchain is that it can replace many trusted human intermediaries, bureaucratic processes with trusted code and technocratic forms of consensus and trust. So blockchain is all about cutting out human and institutional intermediaries. It's about decentralization and the automation of trust. So in response to these debates, my presentation today is attempting to kind of reorientate this discussion and the assumptions within it and direct the debate more towards faith, so from trust to faith. Blockchain is being applied for a range of purposes in forced migration, but there's almost no critical scholarship at all on how the promises for blockchain automation projects are playing out in practice from the perspective of refugees. So my PhD research was undertaken
before the pandemic, I followed a specific blockchain project where a women's organization has been using this digital infrastructure to deliver financial aid in Jordan's refugee camps. And the first site where my research is rooted is in Zaatari refugee camp, close to the Syrian border. Zaatari has a population of about 80,000 of Syria's refugees. And I was also working in Azraq, which has a smaller population of about 40,000 people. Azraq is a really particularly kind of securitized, arid desert environment, really closer to Saudi Arabia, but both of these camps are really carceral spaces, and the Jordanian government uses really acute practices of securitization, mobility control, labor restrictions, and yeah, the domination and control of refugee mobilities is really exercised through, I would say, the tight control of infrastructure. So that includes electricity, Wi-Fi, but what I've looked at in particular in my research is financial infrastructure, the cash economy, and the digitalization of finance in the camps. So in my work, I'm interested in the infrastructures of everyday finance and how they relate in particular to women's own experiences of displacement and their cultures and politics of money. So within the camps, I worked in women's centres with refugee women over the course of 2017 to 2019. And at the women's centres, women are engaged in cash for work schemes. So they undertake kind of weaving, jewellery, embroidery projects, and women are paid to produce goods. For example, the clothing you can see there in the picture. And I conducted ethnographic action research in workshops, focus groups, interviews, and also participant observation, all with local research assistance and support in Arabic from Dina Dajani and Dina Batshun, my friends and researchers. And yeah, so this presentation centers around findings from the women's centers. So in these centers, we saw that the blockchain project transformed a cash for work salary from a physical cash in hand system to a digital wallet system. So the use of blockchain decentralized aid payments. What this meant was that the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, cut out the traditional intermediaries who delivered physical cash. So that's the bank, logistics agency, and the system replaced that with digital technologies. And currently, still, women now must withdraw their salary using a biometric iris scan. I might come back to if anyone's interested in the kind of background literatures, but in summary, there are studies of faith as an abstract concept in science and technology studies. There are studies of religion in STS, in aid and migration studies, and I'm really interested in bringing this research into dialogue. And alongside others, I want to draw attention to the embeddedness of faith, faith-based concepts in everyday socioeconomic life. So not kind of trying not to fetishize faith as a unique, extractable dynamic, but something that's deeply embedded in people's experiences of socioeconomic life in displacement. So now I'm going to discuss the concept of baraka, or barakeh as pronounced in the Syrian accent. So this concept, it was the most used term in my fieldwork when women were evaluating the new digital payments project. So I was really forced to kind of come to terms with this very slippery concept. It's an Islamic concept. It's really significant in this context, but also more broadly in his Muslim life. And there are kind of three main uses of the concept of barakah, which women kind of deployed to contest the digitalization. I've got a few examples here of these examples are from kind of wider everyday life, the kind of ways in which baraka comes up. So I might skip through this, but it's just important to note that there's a picture there that of a mosque in Zatari. There are about 120 mosques in the camp. The populations of both Azraq and Zatari are generally Muslim. Religious practices are really a significant element of everyday life. And baraka, it means, literally it means blessed, but in practice it's much more complicated, and an emic definition might mean a person, a thing, or an act that is through God's blessing substantial and bountiful, or consistent and dependable. So yeah, I'm sort of skipping through this a bit, but here these are the three main uses of baraka that came up in my research. So consistency, bounty, and dependability. So temporal consistency. This was a really important issue as women workers. They consistently described the new digital blockchain system as mish baraka, not baraka. And this was their way of articulating the inconsistency of the new system. So the religious concept gets at the kind of flow or continuity of blessings over time through proximity to God, and not baraka salary is one that's inconsistent and unreliable. So the irony here is that blockchain is kind of celebrated as a seamless automated payment system, but in practice the way it was deployed was disrupted to everyday operations. As Aya's words express here, delays in the salary delivery are a moral and spiritual issue, involving the distress of broken promises and entrenched debt. So a second kind of key use of this religious concept is materiality or bounty, and how women kind of understood the dematerialization of aid from cash into a digital system. So women workers described the value of the cash, how it didn't seem to go as far with the new system, even though the money was exactly the same amount. This faith-based concept helped women to express this idea that it didn't feel bountiful, the money didn't feel like it was going as far because it came in a digital form. And women relied on physical receipts to keep track of their salaries. Most had never used a bank account back in Syria, and receiving a salary meant having physical cash in their hands rather than digits in a digital wallet. So the final use of this baraka concept was to articulate how the quality or value of the cash was diminished because of the untrustworthy nature of the institutions delivering it. So as opposed to an aid agency handing you some cash, the concept of a digital account held at a supermarket was concerning because there was a lack of faith in the supermarkets, because they are private companies rather than humanitarian actors, as a reliable institution to hold your money. So to wrap up, I think trust is a really prominent but an ill-defined concept in tech policy and research. It's become co-opted by technocrats as something that can be automated and ultimately dispensed with. But I want to ask, what if we reorientated the discussion from trust to faith? By contrast, faith gets at the unexpected and not necessarily rational in the eyes of aid actors, ways in which digital infrastructures interface with people's socioeconomic practices, their principles, their sequences and scripts, and their choices and cosmologies. So faith may help us recenter the discussion around the spirit, not just the efficiency or effectiveness of humanitarian giving. And this, as Kuhn suggested when I last discussed this work, this chimes well with research on an ethics of care in in the management of migration and research on it as well. And I think faith also opens up a symmetrical critique, which I'm trying to perform in the rest of my PhD writing, of a critique of the cultish convictions of blockchain proponents, because there's a lack of evidence that blockchain works. There's a lack of an evidence base about what it can do in practice for not just in refugee contexts, but more broadly. And I will be exploring how the COVID pandemic has justified the expansion of digital, biometric and blockchain finance projects, despite this, under the banner of financial inclusion. Ultimately, I think EMIC concepts can help us dismantle assumptions about digitalization, but often kind of the EMIC cultural, religious concepts are immobilized. They're not, they're suppressed or rejected, for example, by aid organizations in the evaluation of programs. But in our work as cultural translators and alongside para-ethnographers, I couldn't have done this work without an array of friends and guides and translators. I couldn't have understood this concept and journeyed between language and culture, as others have discussed today, without the labours and support of others. I think it's really important that we see how cultural and linguistic mobilities are premised on different privileges. That's a methodological note to finish with, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Margie. Also, I see that we're coming full circle with Gerard's keynote in the morning, who made a plea indeed for us to attend to the embeddedness, contextuality, and kind of bottom-up conceptions and experiences, also in line with the concepts that we are working with to inhabit them from the bottom up, let's say. But let's see if there are questions in the audience for us to engage for our three speakers, Audris, Luca, and Margie.
So thank you very much, everyone, especially for our keynote speakers and also for the presenters. We're so actually very honored that you agreed to present, and then we try to juggle the time differences between Australia, New Zealand, different countries. So thank you very much for that one. And also for the presenters, we'll email you about our plan with a special issue in relation to understanding immobilities and digital media migration, and just unpacking some of the very interesting themes that we explored today. I'd like would like to thank Cohen for helping me with the convening of the event, and also how she's our research assistant, emailing everyone with the email, Zoom link, but also recording some of the sessions, and also making sure that we're on time and stuff like that. So thank you very much. Do you have any more, Cohen? You want to say anything before?
I just wanted to thank her for her assistance.
Okay,
I was just applauding.
Okay, I think we can now close the session, and I'll see you around sometime again. But just we'll email everyone about the special issue and also the recording of all the sessions potential. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.